Chapter 347. A delicate hand reached over and gently stroked the head of the pheasant. The pheasant was somewhat dissatisfied, but it did not dare to express any dissatisfaction. It obediently straightened its neck, allowing the hand to stroke it. It looked like a quail. It was Su Yorong's hand. The pheasant knew very well what kind of blood flowed within this girl's body. It disliked it very much, but it had to admit that it was its nemesis. Chun Changxing's hand also reached over, as if he also wanted to stroke it. The pheasant also knew very well how powerful this youngster was. Most importantly, he was the master of the yellow paper umbrella. If it wanted to survive in these terrifying energy storms, it could not offend him, let alone a few strokes. Even if he wanted it to dance a hair removal dance, it would still have to endure. But for some reason, the pheasant extended its sharp beak like lightning and fiercely pecked down on the back of Chen Changxing's hand. A clear sound, like the striking of gold and jade, rang out. The pheasant was stunned. It did not understand why it would do such a crazy thing. Chun Changxing was also stunned. Then he remembered that although the wounds on his body had basically healed and the smell of the blood that flowed out had already become extremely faint, for this kind of creature, it was still an irresistible temptation. Although it is said that a great pung in distress is not as good as a pheasant, it is still a great pung and has its own pride, Su Yorong said while looking at him. This was not the original saying. The original saying was that a phoenix in distress was not as good as a pheasant, but she would definitely not say it like that. Just as she said, this mixed bird that looked like a pheasant was the golden-winged great pung that had previously covered the entire sky, but now it had long since lost its former might. The moment he entered the yellow paper umbrella, Chun Changxing knew that it was the golden-winged great pung. Because of its qi, because of the berserk divine fire in the depths of its eyes, no matter how well it disguised itself, being able to pass through the storm of energy and the hurricane, and knowing that only the yellow paper umbrella could protect it, it was definitely the great pung. The original body of the golden-winged great pung had long since died or left with Zhou Dufu. Only a few days ago, when Nank returned to the garden of Zhou with the soul wood, did its soul, which had always slumbered in the shadows of the grassland, awaken and be reborn. The current golden-winged great pung was still a fledgling, and did not have the strength and cultivation it had when it was at its peak. It was no wonder that it could only transform into a shadow in the sky. Only when Nank fused her soul and the energy of the soul would with the great pung did it recover the majority of its divine might. Chun Changxing didn't try to touch the young rock again. The young pung gradually calmed down and was no longer as nervous and vigilant as before. The berserk intent in the two wisps of divine flames in its eyes receded and was replaced by a very complicated emotion. Chun Changxing understood what it wanted to express and could not help but stare blankly. The information that the young pung wanted to convey was all in its eyes. It was beseeching, requesting, begging, sorrow, sadness, gloom, and despair. The countless monsters in the Garden of Zhou were all its companions and subordinates. These monsters had lived in the grassland for several hundred years, isolated from the rest of the world, and not contending with people. This grassland was their home, and now their home was about to be destroyed. Chun Changxing said in his heart, "I don't need you to ask me anything. I will do my best to preserve this world." The young pung seemed to have heard his thoughts and became even quieter, appearing extremely obedient. However, what was interesting was that it still did not want to approach him. On the contrary, it would rather move a few steps towards Su Yorong, who it should have feared and loathed, and obediently leaned into her embrace. Chun Changxing had always been paying attention to the sandstorm around the mausoleum from the corner of his eye, as he conversed with Su Yorong and mentally communicated with the great pung. He had always been silently making calculations in his heart. According to what Su Yorong had said before, the connection between the 10 heavenly tome monoliths in the surroundings of the mausoleum was a change in some formation. Now that the sword pool had appeared, The balance of the formation had been broken, and there was no way to restore it, unless he could find the sword pool to replace the vanished emptiness. Yes, in this formation, the sword pool was only a replacement. What did the sword pool replace? Su Yurong had said that Zhou Dufu had taken 12 heavenly tome monoliths from the mausoleum of books. There were only 10 stone pillars here, so where were the other 2 heavenly tome monoliths? At the very beginning, Chen Chongsheng always felt that he had forgotten something. It was the emptiness in his memories when he was viewing the monoliths and comprehending the Tao in the mausoleum of books. Afterwards, he vaguely remembered something, and a conjecture uncontrollably appeared in his heart. In order to prove his conjecture, he had always been observing the surroundings of the mausoleum, looking for evidence that could prove his conjecture. He had to obtain sufficient confirmation before he would act on his conjecture, because that would be an extremely risky move. A person only had one life, so he only had one last chance. The sandstorm filled the sky, and the ground around the mausoleum would occasionally accumulate sand dunes like small mountains. Sometimes, even the hard limestone ground would be lifted up. The place he had always been observing was also the place that Su Yurong had calculated. The place that was once covered by white grass and was now covered by sand and monster corpses, finally revealed its true appearance from several hundred years ago. There was a broken stone wall there. It looked like a base of a monolith. There should be a heavenly tome monolith here. Qin Chongsheng had confirmed this fact. With a slight movement of his spiritual sense, he took out an item and held it in his hand. Afterwards, he looked at the young Peng. The young Peng instinctively felt uneasy. It wanted to look in another direction, and did not want to meet his gaze. However, it discovered that because it was too nervous, its neck had actually stiffened. The man and the Peng looked at each other, and the atmosphere was somewhat strange. The young Peng thought in its heart, "Why me?" Chen Chongsheng said in his heart, "Because you are the outstanding golden-winged great Peng. Only you can withstand the devastation of the energy storm, at least for a period of time." The young Peng thought resentfully, "Why don't you go?" Chen Chongsheng tightened his grip on the handle of the umbrella and said in his heart, "Even if I gamble correctly, the Garden of Zhou will still be destroyed. I have even more important things to do." The young Peng's consciousness fell silent and accepted his words. Chen Chongsheng opened his palm, and in the center of his palm was a black stone. This black stone was about half a finger long, and its shape was slender. It was completely black, and the surface of the stone seemed to be covered with a faint layer of mist. It was like a night sky without stars, but with starlight. It caused people to become intoxicated by it, wanting to sink into it. It was clearly not an ordinary object. This was the black stone that he had found behind Wang Zhice's portrait in the pavilion of ascending mist. Seeing this black stone, a hint of fear flashed through the young Peng's eyes. After a while, it calmed down a little and opened its beak to pick up the black stone. Chen Chongsheng turned the yellow paper umbrella to the side, leaving a path for the young Peng to leave. When he was doing these things, he had always used his body to block Su Yurong's line of sight. It was not because he did not want her to discover his secret, but it was not because she wanted to stop him from doing what he was about to do. The wind rose, and the young Peng turned into a black shadow. It flew out of the yellow paper umbrella and passed through the fierce winds and those terrifying cracks in space in the mausoleum. Following the guidance of Chen Chongsheng's line of sight, it flew through the sky full of sand to the very inconspicuous base of the monolith. It released its beak, and after a while, the black stone accurately landed on the base of the monolith. It was as if the starry sky had arrived in the Garden of Zhou that never had a starry sky. It was very dark, but also very peaceful. A powerful and peaceful qi emerged from the base of the monolith. In the next moment, a black heavenly tome monolith appeared on the base of the monolith. Chapter 348. As the black stone landed on the base of the monolith, it turned into a black heavenly tome monolith. A distant and ancient qi emitted from the monolith, and it gradually merged with the chi emitted by the other 10 monoliths. The formation that was hidden in the relative positions seemed to undergo some kind of subtle but absolutely important change with the arrival of this chi. The surroundings of the mausoleum became slightly quieter. The rock on the surface of the stone pillars no longer continued to peel off. The surface of the black monoliths that had already been exposed was suffused with a faint cold light. At least several hundred spatial cracks that were as thin as threads floated between the stone pillars. The spatial cracks that floated between the stone pillars that were like threads were actually very terrifying. They were as gloomy as an abyss, and anything that came into contact with those cracks would be sliced apart. Once it was swallowed up by those cracks, it would be sent into a different space, enduring an eternity of lonely drifting. Fortunately, it was currently bound by some kind of power and did not continue to drift. The clear cry of the young Peng resounded in the whistling gale. This cry was so happy, and it was filled with the delight of succeeding in its revenge. In its previous life, it was Zhou Dufu's mount. It had once personally seen its powerful master suppress those arrogant monoliths. Now it seemed as if it had just happened again. So how could it not be proud? Chen Changxing withdrew his gaze from the spatial cracks and looked towards the 11 stone pillars surrounding the mausoleum. He made another verification according to the deduction method that Su Yorong had mentioned before, and confirmed that the formation had controlled the explosion of energy brought about by the appearance of the heavenly tome monoliths. At the same time, he confirmed that his memories and that seemingly miraculous idea were not wrong. Back then, when he was observing the heavenly tome monoliths at night in the Mausoleum of Books, the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum formed a star chart. However, it was always incomplete, so he was unable to break through that threshold. Only at the very end, when the black stone he had obtained from the pavilion of ascending mist shone brightly and completed the star chart, did he truly comprehend the true meaning of the heavenly tome monoliths, and thus broke through to the upper level of ethereal opening. Countless starlight washed the mausoleum. At that time, he was in a state of mind wandering, and did not know what had happened in his own spiritual world. Afterwards, he even forgot about the use of the black stone, and only had an extremely vague and blurry impression. Fortunately, he still remembered it in the end, and was able to verify it. The black stone behind Wang Jitse's portrait in the Lingyan Pavilion was a heavenly tome monolith. At this point, the greatest secret of the Mausoleum of Books, as well as the greatest secret of the Garden of Zhou, could even be said to be the greatest secret of the continent in the past 1,000 years. Finally, the majority of its true appearance was revealed before his eyes. Although the stories that had happened between those peerless experts had already been destroyed and forgotten, he had already seen some truths. Many years ago, Zhou Dufu had taken away 12 heavenly tome monoliths from the Mausoleum of Books. This matter in itself was extremely shocking, and no one could understand how he had done it. However, at the same time, the fact that he was able to preserve these heavenly tome monoliths outside the Mausoleum of Books was also an extremely unimaginable matter. The heavenly tome monoliths were sacred objects of the heavenly Tao. Contained within the monoliths was a berserk energy that did not belong to this world. That chi and energy came from another world. To this world, they were like countless sparks, while the mountains, rivers, seas, trees, and beastmen of this world were all just a pile of dry firewood. Once dry firewood and intense fire met, countless flames would inevitably be born. Fortunately, countless years ago, when the heavenly tomes descended into the world, it naturally formed some sort of restriction. The heavenly tome monoliths and the earth became one, borrowing the power of the thick earth to rest. As a result, in the Mausoleum of Books, this energy could very calmly be stored within the monoliths. Once they left the Mausoleum of Books, those chi that were incompatible with this world would naturally leave the monoliths and ignite everything in this world. Those distant and ancient chi seemed calm, but to this world, it represented destruction. Therefore, the heavenly tome monoliths could not leave the Mausoleum of Books. Yet Zhou Dufu just had to do this, and he had even succeeded. One of the heavenly tome monoliths had been lost outside for some reason, so he brought the other 11 monoliths into the garden of Zhou. Even though the garden of Zhou was cut off from the world, even though his abilities were close to miracles, he still had no way of hiding the chi of these 11 monoliths, preventing them from coming into contact with the real world. As a result, he used his shocking methods and genius wisdom to think of an extremely wondrous method. He had these 11 monoliths form a formation. This formation was a kind of ingenious imitation of the restrictions of the Mausoleum of Books, or it could even be said to be a miniature version of the Mausoleum of Books. Su Yurong was able to see the connection between these stone pillars in such a short amount of time, and see through Zhou Dufu's wondrous methods, precisely because she had always been studying the Mausoleum of Books and the heavenly tome monoliths since she was young. Relying on this formation, Zhou Dufu made the chi of the 11 monoliths that had left the Mausoleum of Books suppress each other. They came in an endless stream, forming an independent world of their own. Relying on this seemingly fragile balance, he prevented destruction from happening. In order to prevent people from destroying this balance, he left behind countless terrifying monsters in the plains of the unsetting sun. If things continued to develop like this, perhaps after Zhou Dufu died, with the passage of time, the laws of the Garden of Zhou would gradually collapse and the mausoleum would collapse. However, the 11 monoliths that were hidden in the stone pillars would still remain undiscovered, silently enduring the wind and rain for eternity. However, there is no such thing as eternity in this world. In reality, not many years after Zhou Dufu entered the Mausoleum of Books to seize the monoliths, a man had secretly entered the Garden of Zhou and had designs on these stone pillars. Purely in terms of cultivation and battle prowess, that man was obviously inferior to Zhou Dufu, but in terms of other aspects in the hearts of the people, he was even more outstanding than Zhou Dufu. That man was Wang Jitsa. Perhaps it was because he was ordered by Emperor Taizong to search for the whereabouts of the heavenly tome monoliths, or perhaps it was just to confirm some of his conjectures. Wang Jitsa entered the Garden of Zhou, and then, using some unknown method, he took out a heavenly tome monolith from one of the stone pillars. At the same time, he miraculously turned that heavenly tome monolith into a piece of black stone. Zhou Dufu naturally discovered this, and then a problem appeared. One of the 11 heavenly tome monoliths was gone. This meant that the formation that he had spent so much effort on had been destroyed. The Garden of Zhou in the past was probably the same as it was now, filled with storms of energy and whistling hurricanes of destruction. Of course, Zhou Dufu could use his peerless strength to forcefully suppress the eruption of these heavenly tome monoliths. But just like at the very beginning, he could not stay between these heavenly tome monoliths forever, so he had to repair the formation. In other words, he had to find another heavenly tome monolith. It was very obvious that the imperial family of the great Zhou and the orthodoxy, who had already experienced it once, would not give him another chance. Perhaps when he was sitting between the mausoleum and pondering, he saw a sword in the sea of grass that was still unwilling to yield. It could be Chun Xuanba's Dragoncry sword, or it could be the Holy Maiden sword from South Stream Temple. This made him think of a method. Since it was very difficult to find another heavenly tome monolith, then he would find a substitute. Of course, the substitute had to be strong enough and had to have the same power as the heavenly tome monolith. The substitute that Zhou Dufu chose was sword intent. He used the 10,000 sword intents to replace that heavenly tome monolith. Thus, the Garden of Zhou gradually regained its peace. The plains of the unsetting sun became peaceful once more. No one found that mausoleum again, and no one was able to discover the secret within those stone pillars, until some year later, the soul of a sword separated, and the body of the sword flowed out of the plains along a pool of water. It passed through a small lake and went to the world on the other side of the Garden of Zhou. It then floated up along the cold pool and was washed into the forest by the river, where it was picked up by Su Li. As a result, An umbrella appeared in Wen Shui, and that umbrella was now in Qin Changxing's hands. Qin Changxing took the yellow paper umbrella and returned to the garden of Zhou. To the 10,000 sword in tents in the plains, this was a return. Without the suppression of the 10,000 sword in tents, the formation was destroyed and the heavenly tome monolith appeared, beginning to destroy the world. However, no one could have imagined that he would also bring back the heavenly tome monolith that had been left outside. To the garden of Zhou, this was a true return. This could very well be the story from back then. Of course, this was only Chen Changxing's guess. At the moment, he did not know the true secret of the yellow paper umbrella. In this story that he had imagined, there were still many details that were not clear enough. For example, why did Wang Jitsa only take away one heavenly tome monolith? Taking away one heavenly tome monolith was the limit of his abilities. Or was it to say that the original intention of taking away the heavenly tome monolith was not to find it, but to destroy the formation and thus destroy the garden of Zhou, or even to use this method to deal with Zhou Dufu? No one knew what Wang Jitsa was thinking back then, and no one knew if a world-shaking battle had taken place in the garden of Zhou. According to the records of history, Wang Jitsa and Zhou Dufu had never fought. According to the legends of the people, they were sworn brothers, but who knew? Those experts that had once moved unhindered across the continent, the virtuous predecessors of the Star Brilliance capital, the way they interacted with each other, and even the way they fought was not something that the current Chen Changxing could understand. It was not even something that he could imagine. The young Peng passed through those terrifying cracks in space and flew back to the front of the mausoleum. Qin Changxing looked into its eyes, but did not say anything. It understood, and its eyes became gloomy. It thought to itself, "This is a transaction. Since I have already completed it, why should I continue helping you? Also, you can tell from her appearance that she's dead. What if I can't fly out in time?" Yes, it was still somewhat too late. The stone pillars no longer peeled off, and the heavenly tome monoliths no longer emitted clear light. The distant and ancient Qi once again retreated into the depths of the black stone. However, the world of the Garden of Zhou was already riddled with holes. Countless storms of energy were still tearing at the sea of grass and the mountain range. The most terrifying thing was that the sky was still constantly collapsing. The monsters on the grassland seemed to have felt a sliver of life and were madly running away from the mausoleum with all their might. However, the mountain range in the distance was also collapsing. Who knew if they could escape before the world was destroyed? Qin Changxing turned his head to look at Su Yurong. Su Yurong had already felt the changes outside, and her eyes were filled with shock as she looked at him. She understood the formation that Zhou Dufu used the 11 heavenly tome monoliths to form, and she was also the one who told Chen Changxing how to solve the problem. However, she did not think that Chen Changxing would actually be able to solve the problem. This made her very shocked and even somewhat at a loss. Why did he have a heavenly tome monolith? However, she did not have time to say these things, so she did not say anything. The heavenly tome monoliths quieted down. They had to leave quickly and leave together. However, Qin Changxing did not think this way. He looked at the garden of Zhou that was about to be destroyed and said, "You go first. Today is the worst day since the beginning of the book, Choosing the Heavens. I've been sitting there since noon. I want to curse, but I don't have any today. Actually, I understand the reason. It's because the next part of the plot is my favorite, so I don't dare to continue. That kind of fear often appears. Tomorrow, I'll just finish writing this part of the plot. That scene will be very beautiful. See you tomorrow." Chapter 349. Why? Su Yurong's face was rather pale. The gate to the Garden of Zhou is about to open. Chen Changxing glanced at the young Peng, but he was talking about something else. The reopening of the Garden of Zhou was obviously a good thing, but there was no joy in his voice because the collapse was still continuing. He had followed Su Yurong's method and turned the black stone into heavenly tome monoliths, preventing the arrival of destruction. But it was not enough. The snow mountain had already begun to collapse. The initial tremendous power of the world had calmed down again. But who could stop the snow that was gradually falling and getting heavier? A storm of energy arrived in front of the mausoleum, accompanied by a dozen or so terrifying tearing sounds. The mausoleum began to violently shake, and a few huge rocks in the southwest corner collapsed. The azure sky had become gloomy because of the rupture, and there were still many fragments of the sky dancing in the fierce wind. It was unknown when they would fall onto the surface of the grassland. In the distant garden of Zhou, there were countless flowing flames. Black smoke and flames were everywhere, and monsters were fleeing in panic. One could faintly hear many miserable howls and sorrowful sounds. This world was being destroyed. Su Yurong stared into his eyes. She did not have the strength to raise her hand and grab his collar. But that was what she meant. She had indeed said before that even if the heavenly tone monoliths were restored to balance, it would be useless. The Garden of Zhou had already entered the process of destruction. But if the gate to the Garden of Zhou was really about to open, then why did they not leave together? Why did she have to leave first? The sky is about to collapse. He looked into her eyes and said very seriously, and then she looked into his eyes and asked very seriously, if no one holds it, then no one will be able to leave in time. Chen Changsheng raised the yellow paper umbrella and stood up. He turned around and said to her, I have to stay and think of a way to hold on a little longer. Su Yurong's slightly trembling voice was like the lake water startled by the rain. You? What to do? How will you get it? What will you do? He did not know which meaning she was leaning towards with her words. Chen Changsheng looked at her and said very honestly, I'll see what I can do. The heavenly tome monoliths returned to the Garden of Zhou, and the formation stabilized once more, buying the most precious period of time for the people in the Garden of Zhou. The gate to the Garden of Zhou was currently opening, but with the current speed, it was extremely likely that they would not make it in time. If the people outside could not open the Garden of Zhou in time and the sky fell, then the monsters that lived here and the several hundred human cultivators that entered the Garden of Zhou would all die to the sky full of fire. The Garden of Zhou would be destroyed, and so many lives might die. The most direct reason was because he had to take care of all the swords. He did not care about how they saved each other, and they had to go to the depths of the plains. He did not care about the sword intent or the sword. He did not care about the sword and the Zhou. To the Zhou, to Zhou Li and he. He once more, to of the sword Li. He but he and he and to and he to and to. He. The Peng, and he. The Qin of garden. The Peng to and in Qin. He. Shou. He. And Qin. The only thing he could do now was to slow down the rate at which the Garden of Zhou was being destroyed, so that the people in the Garden of Zhou would have time to leave. It was also to comply with the young Peng's request, to fight for a chance for the countless monsters living in the plains to survive. As a result, he had to stay and hope that he could hold on a little longer, to fight for a little more time. But why was that? Su Yurong did not even have the time to ask this question. Her shoulders were grabbed by the young Peng, and she was lifted into the sky outside the mausoleum. The rock said that it could only carry one person. Chen Changsheng didn't have time to give a final explanation. He watched as the young Peng carried her and flew into the distance. Fierce gales danced around the mausoleum. Su Yurong was extremely weak and could not do anything at all. She could only stare blankly at him, standing on the mausoleum. She looked at him very seriously, as if she wanted to imprint his face in her mind. Seeing the figure on the mausoleum grow smaller and smaller, she yelled, Su Sheng, you idiot! The wind was truly very strong. By the time her voice reached the mausoleum, it was already very soft. However, Chen Changsheng heard it and shouted a few words to her. It was just that the wind was truly very strong, so she did not hear it. My name is not Su Sheng. My name is Chen Changsheng. After saying that, he turned around and ran towards the top of the mausoleum. The mausoleum was very large. From the main gate at the end of the divine path to the highest point, there was a distance of several thousand zhang. Moreover, the rock that formed the mausoleum was very large, so it was extremely difficult to climb. Fortunately, he possessed strength and speed that normal people could not hope to reach. In a short amount of time, he arrived at the highest point of the mausoleum. He stood on the rock at the top of the mausoleum and looked at the fire that constantly fell from the distance. He looked at the black smoke and the burning garden, and he looked at the sky that seemed to shatter in front of him and the firmament that was about to collapse. He tightly grasped the sword in his hand. It really was going to collapse. Luo Luo had once said something to him, filled with emotion. That sentence was said to her by the White Emperor. If the sky collapses, there will be someone tall to hold it up for you. Right now, he was at the highest point of the mausoleum, which was also the highest point of the Garden of Zhou. It was even higher than the peak of Sunset Valley. It was closest to the sky, furthest from the ground, and could see the furthest. As a result, he was currently the tallest person in the Garden of Zhou. If the sky collapsed, it should obviously be him who would hold it up. This had nothing to do with the phrase, "With great power comes great responsibility," because he believed that this was originally his responsibility. Moreover, he just happened to have the ability in this aspect. Who would have thought that he just happened to be on the mausoleum with an umbrella in his hand and 10,000 swords in his sheath? He switched a dagger and the yellow paper umbrella. With a swish, the sharp dagger pierced deeply into the rock, helping him stabilize his body in the fierce wind. Afterwards, he extended the yellow paper umbrella in his right hand towards the sky that was on the verge of collapse. With a crash, the yellow paper umbrella was opened in the fierce wind and became a small, cowering yellow flower, as if it could be crushed into powder by the hurricane at any time. This yellow paper umbrella could be said to be the magical artifact with the strongest defensive ability in the world. Together with the proud and powerful sword and tent that shrouded the sky, if it fell into the hands of a true peerless expert, it would definitely blossom with an extremely dazzling splendor. However, it was still impossible to rely on just this umbrella to hold up the sky, even if it was only the sky of the miniature world of the Garden of Zhou, not to mention the fact that the yellow paper umbrella was currently in his hands. As someone at the upper level of ethereal opening, he was obviously very impressive in the younger generation. But in front of this sky, he was so insignificant. "Please come out and help me," Chun Changsheng said in his heart. This was his responsibility, so he had to hold it up. This also seemed to be the responsibility of those swords. But those swords had originally been forced to stay in the Garden of Zhou. So he used the word, "please." Without any pause, following his will, the air around the huge boulder at the top of the mausoleum resounded with countless mournful cries of swords, giving rise to countless strong gusts of sword wind. In that instant, it actually suppressed the hurricane that was wreaking havoc in the Garden of Zhou. Countless swords surged out from the sheath at his waist. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. These swords brushed against the edge of the yellow paper umbrella and then quickly dispersed, just like a firework. The 10,000 swords turned into several dozen sword lines. They rose from the top of the mausoleum and fell into the sky, just like the ribs of an umbrella. This was a huge umbrella that covered 1,000 li. It was held up by Chun Changsheng and held up the sky that was about to collapse. I have to write the next chapter before 9 o'clock. Chapter 350. A huge umbrella made of swords covered the sky of the Garden of Zhou. It blocked the flowing flames that fell from the sky and supported the fragments of space that were about to shatter and fall. The fragments of the sky that were currently falling should not have had any weight, but attached to the surface of the invisible umbrella, they seemed to have infinite weight. With a light paw sound, Chun Changsheng's feet sunk deep into the hard rock. Numerous fine cracks appeared on the edges, and his pants instantly turned into countless shreds. In the next moment, his body began to violently tremble. The unimaginable weight and pressure of the sky directly passed through the 10,000 swords to his body. Every single bone in his body seemed to creak, as if they could break at any time. The terrifying cracking sounds continued to ring out. His 2 feet continued to break through the hard rock. He could no longer support himself, and his left knee softened. Just like that, he knelt down. His knee fell heavily on the rock, smashing into countless gravel and dust. Only a series of muffled rumbles like thunder could be heard from below. Dust rose up, gradually covering the nearby grassland and the white grass path that was no longer the same as before. The entire mausoleum began to tremble, and then, in an extremely short amount of time, it actually sank several feet. This was the weight of the sky. Chun Chongsheng knelt on one knee at the top of the mausoleum. Under the sky, his face became paler and paler, and his expression became more and more pained. His body that had been bathed in the blood of a true dragon could be said to be as tough as steel. Even Nank's peacock plume was unable to break through his external defense. However, under this pure, terrifying weight, even if his body was made of steel, it seemed like it would still be crushed into pieces. Fortunately, it was not the real sky in the end. It was just a fragment of the sky that had been torn down by the storm of energy. Although it was extremely painful, and his soul had almost been crushed to pieces, he still managed to hold on in the end. His body gradually stopped trembling. The 11 stone pillars around the mausoleum had also truly calmed down. Some sort of qi seemed to faintly flow between the black stone tablets. If it were not for the black stone that Wang Jitsa had left behind, no matter if it was him, Su Yurong, or the human cultivators and monsters in the Garden of Zhou, none of them would be like this. At the very least, they would still have a sliver of life. He knelt at the highest point of the mausoleum. His left hand held the yellow paper umbrella, and his right hand held the dagger stabbed into the rock. He raised his head with great difficulty and gazed into the distance, hoping that the sliver of life had already arrived. The cracked sky was already very gloomy, and now it was covered by countless sword images. The world of the Garden of Zhou was even more gloomy. The collapse of the world had temporarily stopped, and the gales on the plains were still madly dancing. One could see that many monsters had already rushed to the edge of the plains, and one could also see that in the distant burning gardens, there were faintly discernible qi that was currently rushing away at high speeds. Had someone already left? Then his line of sight passed through the madly dancing sandstorm and landed in the distance. He could vaguely see that the Peng had already flown out of the grassland with the young girl in its grasp, disappearing into the mountains on the horizon. You have to live well, he silently thought in his heart. The gate to the Garden of Zhou might have already opened, and the people participating in the trial were currently leaving. Those monsters might also have escaped, but he could not leave. Once he withdrew the 10,000 swords, the sky would directly fall down, crushing him and the Garden of Zhou into smoke. The gales on the plains were still violent. His knees were deeply embedded into the rocks at the highest point of the mausoleum, and he tiredly lowered his head. He felt that his situation was just like that famous tragic hero from the myths of the Orthodoxy. On the steep mountain path, the hero who used all his strength to resist the falling boulders would be crushed to death if he relaxed even a little. He could only spend his life fighting against the boulders day and night, endlessly exhausting his life in the process of resisting the boulders. Chun Chongsheng had never thought that he would enter such a despairing situation. He did not want to be a tragic hero, nor did he have any thoughts of sacrificing his life for righteousness. He was not that great. It was just that he wanted to live, and he also wanted many people to live. For example, the people he knew, the people he cared about. Zhixiu, if you are still alive, then live on. Qi Jian, you should also be alive. And that elven girl who had just disappeared into the mountains, the one with the same surname and a beautiful name as him. Lady Chu Jian, you must live well. As for what he should do next, just now, he had said to Su Yurong that he would do as he saw fit. These 3 words actually meant that he did not know what to do, but he really did want to see if the change that he was waiting for would appear. The reason why that famous tragic hero from the orthodoxies, myths, used up all of his time and life in the struggle against that boulder, until he became a stone statue out of despair, was because in that endless period of time, not a single person helped him. The reason why no one was willing to help him was because he was once very arrogant and was never willing to help those lowly commoners. Although Chen Chongqing often made people speechless, no one would think that he was arrogant. Self-confidence and arrogance were never synonymous, and he had always been very willing to help others, such as those human cultivators that were currently fleeing out of the garden of Zhou. Those who achieve the Tao will always receive help. Important figures of the orthodoxy, like Archbishop Mei Li Sha, as well as experts like the solitary drunk under the moon and Zhu Luo, were all outside the garden of Zhou. As long as he could endure for a little longer, these people would definitely come to save him. This was what Qin Chongqing thought. Only, just how long did he have to endure for? How long did he have to endure for? The terrifying weight of the sky caused pain to not a single part of his body. As time passed, the umbrella in his right hand became heavier and heavier, until his arm gradually lost feeling, as if it was crippled. After an unknown amount of time, the black dragon's voice rang out from the dagger stuck in the rock at the top of the mausoleum. Are you all right? Qin Chongqing lowered his head and asked, Are you all right? He was more concerned about its current situation. Previously, in order to resist that golden-winged great Peng, the black dragon's spiritual soul had awoken from the lake outside his ethereal palace, and then entered the dagger. After that, it actually did not have the time to communicate at all. The black dragon was silent for a while, then said, I'm all right. Qin Chongqing said, I'm also all right. I can still hold on for a little longer. The black dragon said, I can understand. This is the so-called double entendre in your human language. But, compared to the dragon language, this kind of technique or complexity is really unbelievably pitiful. Qin Chongqing said tiredly, Can you say something else? The black dragon said, Yes, there's something that you still don't seem to know. I'm wondering if I should tell you, Qin Chongqing said. It doesn't matter. The black dragon's voice became somewhat cautious. You won't die, right? I won't. Qin Chongqing did not even think about it and directly answered. The black dragon was silent for a very long time, then said, It seems that you really are going to die. Qin Chongqing felt somewhat helpless and said, Why do you say that? I said I won't die. The black dragon said, Your answer just now was too fast. You didn't take it to heart. Qin Chongqing was too lazy to pay attention to it, but he faintly felt that something was wrong. He was not surprised that the black dragon could speak the human language, but why was its voice so clear and soft? Just like a girl's, he did not ask, because he was currently really very tired, very painful, and almost unable to hold on any longer. This was the weight of the sky. How long could a mortal last? He did not sweat, but he felt that all the muscles in his body had already been torn apart, and he was about to lose all strength. His mind had already become somewhat dazed, and his true essence had already been exhausted. Even his vision had become a blur. The 10,000 swords were silent, and he was also silent. He had even entered a state of forgetfulness, forgetting everything. After an unknown amount of time, the whistling of the wind gradually weakened, and the pressure brought about by the violent torrents of energy gradually disappeared. The weight from the yellow paper umbrella also gradually disappeared, and the world became quiet. Qin Chongqing opened his eyes, extremely tired, and looked around. Just at this moment, a snowflake fell, landing on the surface of the yellow paper umbrella. Such a gentle snowflake, yet it made his wrist feel a sharp pain, and he almost lost his grip on the umbrella. The Garden of Zhou was snowing? No, this was not the Garden of Zhou. This was a snowy plain. He looked into the distance, and under the shadow of the sky, he could faintly see a majestic city. Where was this? He was very confused, and did not know what had happened. Shock and exhaustion made it impossible for him to move, and he still maintained his previous posture. He knelt on one knee in the snowy plain, his left hand holding the dagger, and his right hand holding the yellow paper umbrella. The sky here had not collapsed, and the snowy plain was beautiful. His current posture was obviously somewhat laughable. The sound of footsteps rang out, and a person walked to his side. With a light sound of surprise, he said, "There's a sword." Then that person extended his hand and took the yellow paper umbrella from Qin Changsheng's hand. The plot of the Garden of Zhou has officially come to an end. Of course, there are still many aftershocks, and the interesting things that everyone wants to see are all at the end. I personally like the plot of the Garden of Zhou very much. That was something that was confirmed in advance last year, and I wrote it very earnestly and diligently. But when the plot of the Garden of Zhou was interrupted, I began to imagine today's chapter in advance. What I wanted was that final scene. I've seriously studied this scene many times with my friends in real life. I've played the scene of Chen Changsheng half kneeling on the snowy plain to deliver the umbrella, and I've also played the scene of a certain pretentious person elegantly taking the umbrella. In short, this scene is the goal of my writing. When I write novels and make up stories, it's always for the sake of countless beautiful scenes. For example, at the Spring Breeze Pavilion at night, when my eldest brother enters the stage in black and white, he also makes a light sound of surprise, and so on. As the saying goes, I won't change even if you beat me to death. That's me. I hope everyone likes it. The Golden Keyboard Awards will be held at the end of the month, so I'll have to trouble everyone to cast a free vote for Heaven's chosen work. Many thanks. Chapter 351. The snowy plains in the early morning were very quiet. Perhaps it was because of the shadow, or perhaps it was because the clouds had not dispersed, but the morning light was very faint. The snow that fell from the morning light was also very sparse, drifting to the ground without making a single sound. This assassination that would inevitably be recorded in history, this assassination that would inevitably change the course of the continent's history, had already occurred for a very long time. Victory and defeat had still not been decided, but the conclusion had already been decided. The mountainous figures of the demon generals were silent and stern. The shadow still hung high in the sky. Black Robe quietly sat on a snowy hill 10 odd li away. The figure surrounded in the middle was still tall and straight, but it was somewhat lonely and desolate. Suddenly, a gust of wind appeared in the snowy plains, swirling up the snowflakes. The dead silence had just been broken by the whistling wind, and then it was completely torn apart by a violent explosion. Countless powerful auras appeared on the snowy hill where Black Robe was. Countless snowflakes sprayed into the sky and in all directions. The few life lamps floating in the air instantly disappeared, and the front of Black Robe was torn. What was even more frightening was that the seemingly indestructible square plate had become a piece of scrap metal just like that. Countless gazes did not even have time to look at the snowy hill where Black Robe sat. Instead, they looked at a certain place in the center of the snowy plains. In the snowy plains, there was suddenly one more person. In the present continent, who could break through the shadow and the heavy defenses of the tens of thousands of demon soldiers and silently arrive here. It was a youth. His right hand held an old umbrella, and his left hand gripped a dagger. His eyes were tightly shut, and his clear and young face was filled with an unswerving determination that could only be seen between life and death. Of course, one could also see endless exhaustion on his face. After an unknown period of time, the youth opened his eyes. This youth was naturally Qin Changsheng. He blankly looked around, but all he could see was snow white. He had no idea what had happened. He only vaguely understood that he had already left the Garden of Zhou. But where was this place? Why was there a shadow in the sky here? Why was the will in this shadow even more powerful and terrifying than the shadow of the great Peng in the plains of the unsetting sun? And what were those 10 odd mountainous figures around the snowy plains? Why did they emit the same qi as that demon general couple, Teng Xiaoming and Lu Wanner? Could it be that those mountainous black figures were all demon generals, And who was that black-robed man on the snowy hill 10 odd li away? Why was the aura emanating from his body so sinister? Why was he wearing a black robe? Chen Changsheng looked at the faintly discernible outline of the majestic city on the outskirts of the snowy plains and thought of the description recorded in the scriptures of the way. His body became extremely stiff, and he opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He thought to himself, it can't be. Could that city be the legendary Xiulao city? This is the infernal snowfield, where those mountain-like shadows really devil generals. The eerie man in the black robe is Black Robe. What about that shadow? Just a moment ago, he had been standing on top of the mausoleum in the garden of Zhou, resisting the falling sky. In the next moment, he had arrived in the snowy plains of the demon realm, tens of thousands of li away. He had seen the figure of the legendary Xiulao city, and he had seen the figures of those demon experts that only existed in his imagination or in books. If his mental strength was slightly weaker, his willpower slightly weaker, perhaps he would have fainted from the shock or even been scared to death, because this scene was just too inconceivable. Chen Changsheng's willpower was very strong, so he did not faint. However, this was not a good thing. He had to remain awake and endure the mental assault brought about by what he saw. He even felt that his spiritual world was showing signs of collapse, and his body was so stiff that he could not move at all. An ant had suddenly arrived in the world of giants. An ordinary person had suddenly mistakenly entered the divine kingdom in the sea of stars. At this moment, he had this sort of feeling. The countless snowflakes that had been thrown into the air rustled down, and then the thin snowflakes that came from the clouds slowly floated down, landing on the surface of the umbrella. The snowy plains were still, deathly silent. Countless gazes, separated by several li, several dozen li, or even several thousand li, stared at Chen Changsheng without making a single sound. To those experts, Chen Changsheng's appearance was also very strange. An ordinary person had suddenly appeared in the divine kingdom. Presumably, those high and mighty gods would also be very surprised as to how this ordinary person had come. The snowy plain sank into a very strange silence. Chen Changsheng's body was incomparably stiff. At the same time that the unimaginably enormous mental assault almost caused his spiritual world to collapse, it also forced his thoughts to quickly revolve. In this extremely short period of time, he thought of many things. Why had he come from the garden of Zhou to the snowy plains of the demon realm? This was something that he definitely could not understand in such a short period of time, so he did not think about it. Then why had he seen so many legendary demon experts? Had these demon experts come to ambush and kill him? This was impossible. He was currently the principal of the Orthodox Academy. His rank seemed to be enough. But to these powerful figures, a youth at the upper level of ethereal opening was truly just like an ant. There was no need for such a large array of forces. Even the most narcissistic Tang, 36, did not dare to think this way. The target that the demon experts wanted to kill was someone else. Who was that person? That middle-aged man who had been surrounded by the tens of thousands of demon soldiers for several days and nights was already heavily injured and faced with certain death. The expression on his face was still undisciplined, as if he did not care at all. However, when he saw the umbrella in Chen Changsheng's hand, his expression became solemn. As if to confirm his own conjecture, he walked towards Chen Changsheng. On the snowy plains, he was the closest to Chen Changsheng. He only needed around 10 steps to reach Chen Changsheng's side. There's a sword. The man extended his left hand and took the umbrella. Chen Changsheng only heard the sound of footsteps, but before he had time to look, he realized that the yellow paper umbrella in his hand had been taken away. He looked at the man. The man wore a long gown, but it was not too long, unlike a scholar. At his waist was a sword, but it did not seem like a swordsman, giving off a nondescript feeling. The man's body exuded a clear and cold qi, like a sword revealing its edge to its heart's content, making it impossible to look directly at him. This was Chen Changsheng's first time seeing Suli. He only saw Su Li's back, and his eyes were pierced with pain. It would still be a very, very long time before he could look directly at this person. At the time, he did not know that this man was the legendary junior martial uncle of Mount Li, Su Li. After a while, he came to his senses and stood up with great difficulty. He subconsciously tightened his right hand. The handle of the umbrella was no longer there, and the feeling of emptiness made him somewhat uncomfortable. For some reason, the yellow paper umbrella in the hands of the middle-aged man seemed to be very harmonious, as if the umbrella had always been his. Seeing this scene, Qin Changsheng was once again perplexed. He suddenly felt that everything that had happened in the garden of Zhou was a dream. He had left the mausoleum of books, gone from the capital to Wenshu to obtain this umbrella, and then entered that plain. Finally, he had miraculously appeared on this snowy plain. He had traveled tens of thousands of li through wind and rain, just to deliver this umbrella into the hands of this man, to return the yellow paper umbrella to this man. Su Li's left hand gripped the middle section of the yellow paper umbrella, and he quietly looked at it. After looking at it for a very long time, a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Then the smile turned into a hearty laugh, a long and loud laugh. He laughed so happily that his face had suddenly blossomed. He gazed at the figure of the demon general that was like a black mountain in the distance, looked at Black Robe sitting cross-legged in the snow, looked at the shadow in the sky, and said, "You all said that I was lacking a sword. Yes, I really was lacking a sword, but now I have a sword. Isn't it your turn to be afraid?" Qin Changsheng did not understand. This was clearly an umbrella, even if there was a strand of sword intent in it. How could it be called a sword? He did not know that this yellow paper umbrella was a peerless sword called Heaven Shrouding. Several hundred years ago, that generation's sect master of the Mount Li sword sect took this sword and fought 300 rounds with Zhou Dufu in the Garden of Zhou. He died, but the sword did not break. This sword was the strongest sword in the sword pool, and it was also the sword that was most unwilling, the sword that most wanted to regain its freedom. This sword was originally the sword that should have been inherited by Su Li. This was his sword. The body of this sword left the plain and was picked up by Su Li. He sent it to Wenshu and used it to create an umbrella of 1,100 changes. But the sword intent was not there, so it was not the sword he wanted. The sword intent of this sword had always been waiting in the plain for the sword to return and reunite with it. Several hundred years later, Qin Changsheng passed by Wenshu and received the umbrella from the Tang clan. He took the umbrella and entered the Garden of Zhou. In the plain, the body of the sword and the sword intent met, thus summoning 10,000 swords to soar through the sky. This story seemed to have welcomed a perfect conclusion, but in reality, this was not the case. Only when he came to this snowy plain and gave the umbrella to Su Li was this conclusion truly perfect. Su Li gripped the yellow paper umbrella and thought back to several hundred years ago, when he first entered the dwelling at the peak of Mount Li and saw the sword hanging on the wall behind his master. He thought back to those years when he forcefully suppressed his cultivation to ethereal opening and entered the Garden of Zhou several times to search for the sword. He felt very emotional. This was Mount Li's sword. This was his master's sword. This was his, Su Li's sword. Several hundred years. It truly had been a long time. How could he not be happy? How could he not laugh to his heart's content? He was laughing, and the yellow paper umbrella seemed to be laughing as well. But there was still a tinge of disappointment and regret in this joyful laughter. "Master, I have grasped this sword once more, but Zhou Dufu is already dead. I do not have the chance to cut him down with my sword and avenge you." A clear and unbridled, yet disappointed and regretful laughter echoed through the silent snowy plain, as if it could be heard from 1,000 li away. The meaning in this laughter was clearly conveyed to the entire world. Even Qin Changsheng understood it, disappointed that Zhou Dufu was already dead, regretful that he could not cut him down with his sword. This was a very self-confident, even arrogant way of thinking. But no one expressed any ridicule or disdain towards this. Even Black Robe only remained silent, because Su Li had already found his sword. Who knew where he would go on the path of the sword? The clear laughter gradually subsided, and the sword glow on Su Li's body also gradually disappeared. He seemed to have become an ordinary middle-aged man. He raised his head and looked around the snowy plain. Those demon generals that were as massive as black mountains had a calm expression. He extended his hand and grasped the handle of the umbrella. His left hand gripped the middle of the yellow paper umbrella like he was holding a sheath. His right hand gripped the handle of the yellow paper umbrella like he was about to pull out a sword. Chen Chongqing noticed that his fingers were very slender, very suitable for playing the zither. Of course, they were even more suitable for holding a sword. The handle of the umbrella was the hilt of the sword. In the instant that Su Li's hand fell on the handle of the umbrella, an extremely swift and fierce sword intent enveloped the entire snowy plain. On the snowy plain several dozen li away, the mountain-like figure of a demon general slightly swayed, then heavily collapsed onto the snowy ground. A stream of blood appeared in the snowy sky. Today was just one chapter. Chapter 352. Su Li's hand gripped the handle of the umbrella. He did not make any other movements, but the sword intent had already penetrated several dozen li away. There was no flash of sword light, nor was there any sword wind. Thin snowflakes slowly floated down, but countless mournful sounds came from all around the snowy plains. Swish, 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 swish. It was the sound of the edge of a sword cutting through space, the sound of the edge of a sword cutting through armor, the sound of the edge of a sword cutting through the powerful bodies of demon generals. Countless fine, white sword marks appeared around the dozen mountain-like shadows of the demon generals. The cold wind suddenly shattered, the heavy armors suddenly split, and blood suddenly spilled. Some of the mountain-like shadows fell on the snowfield with muffled groans, while some of the mountain-like shadows roared and retreated. Not a single demon general could stand where they were. Su Li looked at the snowy hill 10 odd li away, looked at Black Robe who was sitting cross-legged there. The square plate in front of Black Robe had already become a piece of scrap metal. Its surface was densely covered in depressions, and it was no longer able to project everything in the garden of Zhou like before. It was precisely because the square plate had been destroyed that the terrifying explosion had occurred. Even a peerless expert of his level could not bear light injuries. His clothes were tattered, and he seemed to be in a rather sorry state. The square plate of the garden of Zhou had been inexplicably destroyed, causing him to be injured. He sensed that the layout of the garden of Zhou had been broken, and this made him feel very hurt. However, what made him most vigilant and uneasy was the umbrella that Su Li currently held in his hand. This killing trap that had been laid out for a very long time and had mobilized countless experts of the demon race seemed to be about to have a problem. If Su Li wanted to break through the killing trap set up by the demons, he needed to make another breakthrough on the path of the sword. However, just as he had once said, for an expert of the path of the sword at Su Li's level, even the great fear between life and death could not help him break through that barrier that he had not broken through for several hundred years, unless he obtained that sword. Now that sword had come. How was this possible? Black Robe looked at the youth behind Su Li and silently thought, so all the variables were here. He recognized the yellow paper umbrella and knew of its origins. He recognized Chen Chongqing and knew of Chen Chongqing's origins. He was the demon military advisor who was the most adept at scheming on the continent. With just a slight movement of his spiritual sense, he could clearly calculate the events that had occurred in the Garden of Zhou, as well as the events that had occurred before and after the Garden of Zhou, without the slightest error. However, no matter how clearly he calculated, he could not change what had already happened, nor could he make the yellow paper umbrella leave Su Li's side. Black Robe stood up. His slightly blue hands stretched out from his sleeves, as if he wanted to crush all the cold winds on the snowy plains. Su Li quietly looked at him. The two were separated by more than 10. Su Li gripped the handle of the umbrella, his fingers slightly exerting force. All that was heard was a crisp sound. A bright blade was drawn from the yellow paper umbrella. As it turned out, this was the true body of the yellow paper umbrella. The sword had always been hidden in the yellow paper umbrella. The sword was not fully drawn. Only half of the sword appeared between heaven and earth. On the snowland, the wind and snow suddenly grew stronger. The thin snowflakes transformed into countless invisible swords, roaring and sweeping across, reaching the snowy hill that was over 10 miles away in an instant. The black-robed man lowered his head and clasped his hands together. His hands, which were faintly glowing with green, were placed in front of his face as if he was bowing. Together with the black-robed man, everything was covered. An extremely cold chi greeted the sword-like snowflakes. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. Countless sounds of ripping resounded on the snowy hill. In the space around the black-robed man, countless clear and sharp sword glows appeared. In the next moment, the tip of the black-robed man left the snowy surface. The black-robed man floated up, his clothes and his body both light. Accompanied by the wind, snow, and sword glows, he floated backwards, disappearing into nothingness. The sword glows gradually faded, the sword cries gradually quieted, and the wind and snow gradually slowed. A black piece of cloth slowly floated onto the snowy plains. At the same time, there was also a streak of dark red blood. From more than 10 li away, Su Li had injured Black Robe with a single strike. Although Black Robe had suffered significant injuries from the destruction of the square plate and was not at his strongest, it could not be forgotten that the sword in Su Li's hand was not completely unsheathed. Half of it was still hidden in the yellow paper umbrella. Then, just what sort of strike was this? Su Li did not pay any attention to the retreating, black-robed man. He gazed at the faintly discernible silhouette of the demon city in the depths of the snowy plains. He gazed at the shadow in the sky that contained an endless pressure and a terrifying will. The expression on his face became more and more solemn, but his eyes became more and more fanatical. He yelled, "Come and fight!" With this shout that was like the cry of a sword, a true sword cry resounded through the snowy plains. Su Li's right hand grasped the handle of the umbrella and pulled it out. The body of the sword, radiating with cold light, appeared on the snowy plains. After several hundred years, the famed heaven-shrouding sword finally saw the light of day again. The first opponent it saw was the demon lord. This sort of return, how tyrannical, how arrogant. The name of the sword, heaven-shrouding sword, was. No matter how vast the sky was, as long as this sword was in front of one's eyes, one could not see it. No matter how terrifying the shadow in the sky was, one could not see it if one wanted to. Su Li's left hand held the yellow paper umbrella, and his right hand casually held the heaven-shrouding sword. As he gazed at the shadow in the sky, he had an imposing manner that could rebuke the heavens and rebuke the earth. This sort of person, just how powerful, just how heroic! As he gazed at Su Li's back, Qin Changxing was moved and speechless. He knew that he was about to personally witness a battle of the highest level that the continent had seen in several hundred years. Perhaps he would very quickly die in the clash of qis in this battle, or perhaps the two parties participating in this battle would not even notice his death. However, he did not feel cold, and even felt somewhat hot. This heat came from his heart, from his blood. In life, there would always be moments of hot-bloodedness. Even if he had just left the Garden of Zhou and was inexplicably drawn into this battle between gods, even if he suddenly died, he did not care. The journey to the Garden of Zhou had truly not been made in vain. To be able to personally see such a heroic figure, to be able to see such a peerless sword once again shine with its edge, what did life and death matter? At this moment, Chen Changxing had already vaguely guessed who this extraordinary human expert standing in front of him was. His hand gripped the hilt of the sword, and several powerful demon generals fell. He pulled out half of the sword, and Black Robe, heavily injured, drifted far away. Right now, his sword was completely unsheathed, and his body was also completely unsheathed. Facing the snowstorm and the shadow in the sky, he released his edge to his heart's content. Just what sort of power would this third sword have? Would it be able to cut through the sky and directly cleave that shadow under the sword? In just an instant, Qin Changxing thought of many things. He felt that his spiritual world had been meticulously cleansed by the sword intent that enveloped the entire snowy plains. He had obtained an unprecedented courage and fighting spirit. If he could survive, he believed that these gains would definitely make him even stronger. However, just at this moment, a voice suddenly entered his ears. "Hold the umbrella." Chen Changsheng looked at the back of the middle-aged man and knew that the voice should have come from him. However, he did not understand what it meant and was somewhat at a loss. "Hurry up and hold it, or else I'll run away first." Su Li looked at the shadow in the sky, his expression firm and unswerving, his aura extraordinary. Who would have thought that, at the same time, he was quietly saying such unimposing words to Qin Changsheng? Qin Changsheng stared blankly. He did not know what was going on and said, "Senior." Su Li did not turn around. Holding his sword, he looked up at the sky, his expression very calm. However, his voice was very urgent, and he seemed very anxious. Moreover, in order to not let the demons discover him, his thin lips did not move, and when he spoke it felt like he was gnashing his teeth. "Before your head, you pig head! Hurry up and come over here. Reach out and grab it." Chen Changxing was truly stunned, and he even began to doubt his life. "Senior, aren't you that legendary expert? Aren't you able to move unhindered across the continent with a single sword? Aren't you going to fight with that shadow? Aren't you going to fight with him? So, from the very beginning, you never thought of fighting and only thought of running away? Aren't you acting like a hero right now? Isn't this a fake fight?" Qin Changxing was unable to describe his current mood. On the surface, this senior seemed heroic and fierce, with a heroic and generous air. Who would have thought that it was actually like this? He could not find the right words. He wanted to say that this was very lowly, but he also felt that it was somewhat disrespectful. An idol that had been erected in his heart for not even a few breaths of time had collapsed with a loud bang. However, he had no other choice. Even this senior wanted to run away. Did he still want to stay behind and fight with that terrifying shadow? Qin Changxing's gaze fell on the yellow paper umbrella. His mind was somewhat absent-minded, and he extended his hand to grab it. Su Li looked at the shadow in the sky, his expression indifferent. He had the demeanor of an expert, and only Chen Changxing could hear the voice that came out from between his teeth. "You pig head! Hold on tight, or else if you drop halfway, I won't stop to pick you up." Very obediently, Qin Changxing tightly gripped the front of the yellow paper umbrella and even added another hand. Clear and arrogant laughter suddenly resounded, incessantly echoing through the snowy plains. Su Li looked at the demon army in the snowstorm, looked at that shadow. After a moment of silence, he yelled, "Watch my sword!" This was the first sword that the heaven-shrouding sword had truly slashed out after it reappeared in the world. It was also the most powerful sword that he had used in the several days and nights that he had been besieged by the demons. In the snowstorm, the mountainous figures of the demon generals became extremely solemn, and the tens of thousands of demon soldiers even further away became even more silent. Even the shadow that came from Shuilao City and covered half the sky became much more solemn. This sword would inevitably condense Su Li's entire lifetime of cultivation. Even the demon lord was somewhat fearful. The fierce gale suddenly shattered the flying snow, and the sword intent that enveloped the snowy plains suddenly compressed, transforming into an unimaginably powerful sword energy that slashed down towards the world. Su Li attacked. He slashed his sword at the sky. However, it was not the shadow in the sky, but the half of the sky opposite the shadow. The southern sky. There was a soft chi sound. The several thousand essence chi locks that the demons had placed in the snowy sky were all shattered by that sword intent. In the suddenly violent snowstorm, an extremely clear path of the sword appeared, leading out of the snowy plains. With an unimaginable speed, Suli transformed into a stream of light and shot into that path of the sword. His left hand gripped the yellow paper umbrella, and Chen Chongqing hung from the end of the umbrella. Chen Chongqing's body was already floating. With a howl, Su Li and Chen Chongqing became black dots, gradually moving further and further away. In the next moment, the path of the sword disappeared, and the two also disappeared. I've always been thinking about what words to use to describe Su Li. When he appeared for the first time and shouted, "Quickly come and save me," the tone was set. He truly is despicable. He was originally the sword sovereign of this world in choosing the heavens. I'm not Chen Chongqing, so I don't need to respect the elderly. I just feel that the word despicable is insufficient to describe him. So I'll let him despicable travel 10,000 li. The next chapter should be done before 9 o'clock. Chapter 353. The snowstorm gradually slowed and the snowy plains fell silent. But not long after, the ground began to tremble and the accumulated snow began to loosen. Countless demon armies galloped past in pursuit of the south. The shadow in the sky slowly returned to Shualao City. At some point, Black Robe had returned to the scene. Several demon generals silently stood behind him. The scene once more returned to silence. For a very long time, not a single sound could be heard. These important figures of the demon race seemed to have no idea what to say. Who could have imagined that the strongest expert of the southern continent was actually this sort of person? When a true expert suddenly becomes shameless, it truly is very troublesome. Black Robe's voice was still emotionless. Occasionally, a cold wind would sweep past, lifting up a corner of his hood and revealing a slightly green chin. The demon generals deeply believed this. For someone as strong as Su Li to use such a low-class trick at a time like this was truly beyond their expectations. Was this probably the principle of the most despicable being invincible? Black Robe gazed at the footprints Su Li had left in the snow and was quiet for a very long time. Then she indifferently continued, "His injuries are already very heavy. Although he succeeded in deceiving His Majesty's eyes, that final strike must have exhausted all of his blood. There's no reason for him to continue. It was impossible for a single strike to truly travel 10,000 li, but to be able to slash out a path of the sword through the layers of arrays constructed by the demon experts to travel several hundred li. One could imagine just how powerful that strike was. Just as Black Robe had asserted, even someone as strong as Su Li would have to pay an enormous price to wield that sword. 600 li southwest of Shualao City was a snowy mountain range. The cold weather did not freeze all the scenery, and white steam rose from the mountain range. As it turned out, there were many hot springs in the mountain range. Beside one of the hot springs, a snowstorm suddenly blew. As the snowflakes slowly drifted down, the figures of Su Li and Chen Chongqing gradually appeared. Su Li had already returned his sword to the yellow paper umbrella. His right hand lightly brushed away the snowflakes in front of him. His bearing seemed extremely tranquil and casual. In comparison, Chen Chongqing was in a much more sorry state. His hand still tightly gripped the front section of the yellow paper umbrella. Sitting in the snow, he looked like a little beggar begging for food. Demons clearly have pretty good intelligence, but for some reason, they always act very stupid. Those demon generals will definitely lead their people south in pursuit. Su Li turned his head to look the path he had come from. His sharp gaze that was like a sword ray pierced through the layers of wind and snow, landing somewhere unknown. The corner of his lips perked up, revealing an expression of ridicule. He didn't say this to Chen Chongqing, but to himself or to comfort himself. But Chun Chongqing didn't know. He climbed up from the snow with some difficulty and said, "Senior, this is still the demon realm after all. We should leave as soon as possible." At this moment, Su Li seemed to notice the existence of the youth. He glanced at him, but did not say anything, nor was he in a hurry to leave. Instead, he walked towards the hot spring at the side. Chun Chongqing's hand loosened the yellow paper umbrella. Seeing him walk into the hot spring, he did not know what was going on. Suddenly, a series of sounds rang out around the hot spring. Some of the sounds were very shrill, as if sharp swords were slicing through space. Some of the sounds were very loud, as if a hammer was striking a rock. Some of the sounds were very muffled, as if someone was speaking in the depths of the hot spring. Along with these sounds, countless powerful qis floated out from Su Li's body. They were the sword intent of the demon general's metal sword, the wind and thunder intent of the metal rod, and the gloomy intent of black robe. The rocks around the hot spring were frozen until they became brittle and then began to crack. The snowy mountain range was filled with the cries of swords and the roar of thunder. Even the surface of the hot spring that gurgled with steam was covered in countless cracks. Only after a very long time did it once again calm down. Su Li stood knee-deep in the hot spring, his long gown in tatters. His body was covered in countless wounds, blood constantly dripping from them. In a place so close to Shulao City, he was surrounded by tens of thousands of demon soldiers, surrounded by tensome demon generals, with the demon military advisor, Black Robe, quietly watching from the side, and the will of the demon lord transforming into a shadow that covered the sky. This was the greatest killing trap in the last several hundred years, and Su Li had persisted for several days and nights. There were no tears on his clothes, not even a single snowflake. He did not seem injured at all, but in reality he had already suffered very heavy injuries. The demon generals that he had killed, Black Robe that he had exchanged blows with, and even the will of the demon lord had left behind many terrifying wounds and killing intent in his body. It was just that these wounds and killing intent had all been forcefully suppressed by his valiant will and transcendent cultivation. Only when he obtained the yellow paper umbrella, unsheathed the heaven-shrouding sword, cut open a path in the snowy sky, and arrived several hundred li away. After confirming that he was temporarily safe, he was no longer willing to continue using his true essence to suppress it. Thus, those wounds and killing intent exploded in an instant. The majority of the killing intent had been forcefully delivered to the snowy mountain range, allowing the world to bear it in his place. However, the wounds still remained in his body. His face was snow-white and his expression weary. Only the undisciplined qi on his face remained the same. Hearing the whistling of swords and the rumbling of thunder in the snowy mountain range, feeling the overflowing, terrifying, and cold killing intent, seeing the blood-covered Su Li and the hot spring water that was gradually dyed red, Chun Chongqing paled in shock. With a trembling voice, he asked, "Senior, are you all right?" Su Li did not answer his question, but asked, "Are the Mount Li disciples in the garden of Zhou all right?" Chun Chongqing shook his head. "I don't know." Su Li said nothing. He gazed at the distant dusky sun in the snowy mountain range, thinking about something. Chun Chongqing was very worried. He repeated his question, "Senior, are you all right?" Su Li turned around and looked at him. "Do you know who I am?" Chun Chongqing had previously believed that he had guessed the identity of the senior, but this senior's behavior was truly different from the rumors. At that moment, he directly began to doubt his life. Naturally, he also began to doubt whether he had guessed incorrectly. He hesitantly asked, "May I ask for Senior's great name?" Su Li replied, "I am Su Li." Chun Chongqing was very shocked. He had not thought that he had guessed correctly, that he had really guessed correctly, because he had not thought that the legendary marshal, granduncle of Mount Li would actually be such a person. And then he asked. Su Li was somewhat displeased. He rebuked, "This order isn't right. Let's go again." Chun Chongqing was slightly taken aback. Ah. Su Li looked into his eyes and asked again, "Who am I?" Chun Chongqing stared blankly, then said, "Senior, you are Mount Li's junior martial uncle Su Li. Su Li then asked, "In the rumors, what kind of person am I?" Chun Chongqing did not know why the senior, covered in blood and looking extremely exhausted, would ask these questions. After thinking it over, he still seriously replied, "Senior is a genius of the path of the sword that has never been seen before. Your cultivation has long since reached perfection, and you can be considered a legendary figure." If this sort of evaluation was said to his face, it would be very easy to take it as flattery. However, Chun Chongqing said it very seriously because what he said was the truth. As a result, when these words came out of his mouth, they seemed especially sincere and trustworthy. This made Su Li extremely satisfied. He looked at Chun Chongqing and said with gratification, "Although this junior's strength is terrible to the extreme, he still has some experience." At this time, Chun Chongqing really did not know what to say. As he saw more and more blood flow from his body, he could not help but ask again, "Senior, are you really all right?" Su Li smiled. "You just said that I am a genius of the path of the sword that has never been seen before. My cultivation has long since reached perfection, and I can be considered a legendary figure." Chun Chongqing thought to himself, "To be able to remember every single word of what I said, it seems that there shouldn't be any major problems. So, for a person like me, how could anything happen to you?" Following that, Su Li said joyfully. Then, like a stone pillar that had been cut apart, he fell forward, falling into the hot spring. Water splashed everywhere, and the hot spring water that had been dyed red incessantly rippled. Su Li's body incessantly bobbed up and down in the water. Only after a while did Chun Chongqing understand that this senior had actually fainted. He hurriedly jumped into the hot spring, carried him out, and then placed him on the ground by the hot spring. Almost at the same time that his body landed on the ground, Su Li began to snore. To be able to last until now, he was truly too tired. Chun Chongqing did not know this. Looking at this senior, he did not know what to think. What he had said just now was true. In the hearts of the younger generation of cultivators, although Su Li was not ranked among the storms of the 8 directions, nor did he have the title of a saint, he was the idol of the younger generation of cultivators. Even someone as narcissistic and proud as Tang 36 had no objections, because compared to the Divine Empress and the Pope, these sacred and dignified saints, compared to the Elder of Heavenly Secrets and the solitary drunk under the moon, these storms of the 8 directions that obeyed the rules, the junior martial uncle of Mount Li roamed the 4 seas, and the songs of his sword could be heard everywhere. He represented the freedom that the young yearned for. And yet, as it turned out, the junior martial uncle of Mount Li was actually this sort of person. Chun Chongqing could no longer remember how many times he had this sort of sigh. He felt that the shock that this senior had brought him was even greater than the sword pool and the heavenly tome monoliths in the Garden of Zhou. Seeing Su Li's indifferent expression as he slept, hearing his thunderous snores, he suddenly felt that he was rather similar to Tang 36. Then he remembered that Tang 36 had once evaluated him and Su Yorong as people that made people speechless. This junior martial uncle of Mount Li was the one that truly made people speechless, right? See you tomorrow. Chapter 354. Perhaps it was because he was too heavily injured, or perhaps it was because he had been soaked in the hot spring. But Su Li's face was slightly swollen. His 2 eyes were tightly shut, and his heroic spirit had completely dissipated. At the very beginning, that sharp sword glow that Chun Chongqing could not look at directly had disappeared to some unknown place. He seemed just like an ordinary person. Just at this moment, the black dragon's spiritual soul left the dagger and returned to the jade rui tied to his waist. It transformed back into a seemingly real black dragon and flew onto Chun Chongqing's shoulder. Looking at the surrounding snowy mountains, it asked blankly, "Where is this place?" Have we left the Garden of Zhou? Chun Changxing shook his head. I also don't know what's going on. As soon as we came out, we encountered such a large force. When the black dragon was in the dagger, it could only sense the outside world through Chun Changxing's spiritual sense. It did not know what had happened earlier, so it asked in confusion, "What force?" The yellow paper umbrella was taken by this senior, and it was actually a dagger. Of course, that's not important. Just now on the snowy plains, that black-robed male demon might very well be that rumored demon military advisor. There were also 10 odd demon generals, and every single one of them was as strong as Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wanner. There was also that shadow. I really suspect that it was the demon lord. Chun Changxing gave a simple description of the force on the snowy plains. The black dragon was shocked speechless. Even if it had recovered its true form as a black frost dragon beneath New North Bridge, if it encountered powerful figures like Black Robe and the Demon Lord, it would still die, let alone a weak spiritual soul right now. It looked at the middle-aged man sleeping by the hot spring and asked, "Then who is this human? He actually survived and even managed to escape with you?" Chun Changxing replied, "He is the junior martial uncle of Mount Li, Su Li." Upon hearing this name, the black dragon's body began to tremble, letting out a crisp cry. The jade Rui seemed like it was about to shatter. Chun Changxing asked in confusion, "What's wrong?" The black dragon looked at Su Li, its bewitching vertical pupils constricting slightly. It seemed extremely frightened and said, "He is very powerful." Chun Changxing thought about how, on the snowy plains, Su Li's hand had fallen on the hilt of his sword and beheaded a demon general. Halfway out of the sheath, his sword had heavily injured Black Robe. He thought to himself, although this senior's way of doing things is somewhat absurd and wretched, in terms of cultivation in the path of the sword, he truly is incomparably powerful. It's just that Senior Black Dragon is also an extremely proud and tyrannical divine being. So why is he so afraid upon hearing his name? I have never met him, but I know that he has killed many dragons. The black dragon glanced at the yellow paper umbrella in Su Li's hand. Without the slightest hesitation, it transformed back into a spiritual soul and hid itself in the dagger. No matter how Chun Changxing called for it, it refused to come out. Chun Changxing was very confused and somewhat helpless. He looked at Su Li and discovered that even in his sleep, this senior still tightly gripped the yellow paper umbrella, unwilling to let go. Then he thought of the question Su Li had asked before he fell asleep. He did not know what the current situation was in the Garden of Zhou. He did not know whether those people had successfully escaped, whether Zhixiu and Qi Jian were still alive, whether that Mount Li sword sect, disciple Yang Xiao, who had betrayed humanity and colluded with the demons, was still alive. And how is she now? Was she all right? He was very worried about these things and also very impatient. He wanted to return to Hanzhou City, or the capital, as soon as possible and confirm how those people he cared about were doing. At the same time, he wanted to tell those people who cared about him that he was safe and sound, that there was nothing wrong with him. Otherwise, once Luluo found out about the Garden of Zhou, just how worried would she be? Yet, how could he leave now? Hearing the thunderous snoring, he somewhat helplessly shook his head. He squatted by Su Li's side and began to examine his injuries. No matter how anxious he was to leave, he could not just abandon this senior. Even if he was currently very tired and his true essence had been completely consumed, he still had to continue holding on, because this senior was clearly on the verge of dying. Su Li's clothes were already in tatters. Those injuries and the sword intent had all exploded in that instant, directly piercing through his body from the inside out. There were wounds everywhere, marks left behind by extremely pure energy burning everywhere. Even with Chun Changxing's superb medical skills and rich experience, for a moment he still did not know what to do. Moreover, he currently did not have any medicine on hand, not even a piece of cloth to bandage his wounds with. The only thing he could use was the golden needle wrapped around his finger. The golden needle pierced through the dense hot mist and accurately landed on Su Li's neck, slowly and firmly penetrating in. What made Chen Changxing somewhat comforted was that not long after he inserted the needle, Su Li woke up. It seemed that this senior's cultivation was indeed different from that of ordinary cultivators. Such serious injuries were nothing to him. If that was the case, perhaps he could leave now? Su Li glanced at him. His expression was very cold, completely indifferent and distant, as if he was looking at a stranger. Chen Changxing could accept this point. He and this senior had always been strangers. It was just that this Mountley senior's eyes had a hint of condescension in them, a hint of disdain like a god looking at an ant. It still made him feel somewhat uncomfortable. In the next moment, Su Li's indifferent and distant emotions gradually disappeared. Perhaps it was because Chen Changxing did not take advantage of his sleep to leave, and was still thinking of ways to treat his injuries, which made him somewhat satisfied. "Who are you?" He looked at Chen Changxing and asked. Before he fell asleep, Su Li had asked several times, "Who am I?" Of course he knew the answer. He just wanted to use this question to draw out a prideful conclusion. "I am such a supreme expert. How could anything happen to me?" This was the first time he thought of asking this youth's name. Chen Changxing thought about it, then decided to tell the truth. However, without waiting for him to speak, Su Li continued, "Who you are is not important. What I want to say is, although this sword was originally mine, it was still you who sent it to my hands. In order to express my gratitude, I have decided to pass on a sword style to you." Su Li stood up and glanced at the yellow paper umbrella in his hands. It was unknown what he was thinking. Chen Changxing stood behind him, seeming somewhat hesitant. Su Li did not turn his head. He coldly said, "You don't need to shed tears of gratitude, and you also don't need to report your sect or school in an attempt to establish some relationship with me and scheme for even more benefits." Just as he finished speaking, Chen Changxing said without hesitation, "Orthodox Academy, Chen Changxing." He was very clear on the relationship between the Orthodox Academy and the Mountley Sword Sect, or more accurately, his own relationship with the Mountley Sword Sect was not very good. It could even be said to be extremely terrible, but he did not want to lie. Moreover, this Mountley senior's conduct made him rather displeased, so he said it and said it very loudly. The snowy mountain range was slightly cold, and the hot spring bank was silent. Su Li stood on the rock by the spring and expressionlessly said, "I'll give you another chance." Chen Changsheng looked at his back and felt somewhat cold. However, he did not know where this energy came from, but it made him say it again. Orthodox Academy, Chen Changsheng. This time his voice was even louder, but his tone was even calmer. Su Li slowly turned around and looked down at him in the eyes. He said, "It seems like you're a person who doesn't know how to cherish opportunities. Let's try to finish the next chapter before one." Chapter 355. Before the age of 16, he had already entered the upper level of ethereal opening and created a record with Su Yurong. In the younger generation, Chen Changsheng was unquestionably a genius. Even when compared to those peerless experts of the same age in history, he was not the slightest bit inferior. However, he was still only a youth. The distance between him and Su Li was incomparably far, like the vast ocean. Even if Wang Pa of Tianliang painted armor Xiaozhang, Liang Wang's son, these experts of the proclamation of liberation were all thrown into that ocean, it would still be impossible to fill it up. In the world of cultivation, Su Li was a god, and he was only an ordinary person before a god. To be lectured by a senior expert that was like a god from high above, if it were any other junior, they would probably have already bowed and admitted their wrongs, or perhaps become fearful and afraid to speak. Chen Changsheng was also very nervous, his body slightly trembling, but his voice was still calm and firm. "I don't understand senior's meaning." He treasured his life and time, and believed that lying was an extremely uneconomical method of communication, so he had always been willing to speak the truth. This was the truth. He did not know what chance Su Li was talking about. That sword style that he was prepared to pass on to him? or the chance to leave alive? Su Li looked at him expressionlessly and asked, "Who am I?" This time, Chen Chongsheng had learned his lesson, so he naturally would not misunderstand like he did in the beginning. However, he was not in a good mood, so he stubbornly closed his mouth and refused to answer. Su Li was clearly very experienced in this sort of situation. There was no awkwardness on his face, and he very naturally pointed at his own face and answered his own question. "I am Mount Li's Su Li." His voice suddenly rose and became incomparably cold. "I only need a glance to see through Black Robe's technique. How could I not see that you are Chen Chongsheng? It's precisely because I saw that you were Chen Chongsheng that I told you not to say that you were Chen Chongsheng. I let you redo it. So why did you insist on saying it? What is the meaning of this?" His shout was like a sword, and Chen Chongsheng only felt his entire body go cold. He thought to himself, "Senior, just what is the meaning of this?" Su Li's eyes slightly narrowed. He looked at him and said, "If you weren't the Orthodox Academy's Chen Chongsheng, or if you didn't say you were the Orthodox Academy's Chen Chongsheng, I could pretend that I didn't know you were the Orthodox Academy's Chen Chongsheng. In order to return the favor of giving me the umbrella, I could pass on a sword style to you. Regretfully, you missed this opportunity." After hearing these repetitive words, Chen Chongsheng finally understood what the senior was thinking. After a moment of silence, he said, "I am Chen Chongsheng of the Tradition Academy. Then why can't I admit that I am Chen Chongsheng of the Tradition Academy? This is more important than the opportunity that senior mentioned." "Impossible." Su Li angrily flicked his sleeve, but his sleeve was already tattered and wet from the hot spring water, so his action did not seem at all elegant and at ease. On the contrary, it seemed very pitiful, but he did not care about this point. Looking at Chen Chongsheng, he said, "To be able to receive the personal instruction of sword techniques from me, Su Li, no matter which school student or sex disciple, they will inevitably be pleasantly surprised, moved to tears, and fearful. Who would be willing to miss out on such an opportunity? That would be spurned by the starry sky." Chen Chongsheng was very speechless. He thought to himself that this person's narcissism and pride was something that even Tang 36 would not be able to catch up to even if he lived for another 500 years. Suddenly, Su Li calmed down, and his expression gradually grew cold. He looked at Chen Chongsheng expressionlessly and said, "I understand." Chen Chongsheng continued to be speechless. He thought to himself, "I don't even understand, so what can you understand?" Su Li looked at him and said mockingly, "Everyone says that among these juniors your talent is extremely high and your knowledge is extremely broad. How could you not know that learning the sword from me is such a rare opportunity? You purposely announced your identity so that I would not be able to teach you sword techniques, and thus make me owe you a favor?" Chen Chongsheng thought to himself, "What does this mean? This senior really likes to talk to himself too much, and he's really too narcissistic. Could it be that a favor from you is so important? Everyone knows that Qiu Shan is my favorite junior. Today, you want me to owe you a favor. In the future, when you and Qiu Shan get into a fight because of that girl you're on, you want to use this favor to make it inconvenient for me to speak, or at least inconvenient for me to take action." Su Li looked at him and smiled. "You, this youngster, very precocious, very sinister." This smile was very cold, very mocking, very condescending, as if it could see through everything. Chen Chongsheng was silent and felt very uncomfortable. He knew that he could not continue to be speechless, so he explained, "Senior, you're thinking too much." "Is that so? The reason you said your name is because you're virtuous and don't want to take advantage of my Mountly? Or is it because you value your honor far more than learning a few sword techniques from me? If that's really the case, and you have nothing to gain from me, then what are you still standing here for?" Su Li looked at him with a smile that was not a smile, and said with unspeakable mockery, "You stole my Mountly disciple's first place on the first banner in the grand examination, and you also want to steal my Qiu Shan's wife. You yourself don't want the favor of giving me the sword, So what are you waiting for? Waiting for when my mood is bad and I'll cut you down with my sword? These words were so ruthless, so cold. Su Li's conduct could not be said to be returning kindness with enmity, but it was still extremely tyrannical and rude. Chun Changxing's breathing was slightly rough. He wanted to suppress the anger in his heart and say a few more words of explanation, but in the end he still said nothing. After a moment of silence, he wrapped the needle back around his finger, turned around, and walked out of the snowy mountain range. The wind and snow gradually rose, and in a short while they concealed the lonely figure of the youth. Hurry up and scram. If you can leave the demon domain alive, consider your luck pretty good. Su Li looked in the direction he disappeared in and said with a sneer, Who are you putting on such a proud and unyielding appearance for? For some reason, after saying these words, he suddenly fell silent. Gazing at the snowy sky in the north, he sighed. When that kid left the garden of Zhou, he did not even ask about that girl's situation. He deserved to die. He took off his wet and tattered clothes, leaving behind only a pair of underpants. He walked into the hot spring, slowly sat down, and then laid back down. Whether it was undressing, moving, or even lying down in the hot spring, his movements were all very slow. It was as if even moving a finger was extremely difficult. He leaned against the white rock by the hot spring, extended his hand, and plucked a jasmine flower from a crack in the rock. He brought it to his nose and gently sniffed it. Who knew that in this world of wind and snow, a fresh flower could be born? Even if there was a hot spring, why did it have to be jasmine? He was rather tired and could not be bothered to think about these questions. He placed the yellow paper umbrella to the side and closed his eyes. At this moment, the tens of thousands of demon soldiers and those terrifying experts were still searching everywhere for traces of him. Yet he was like a tourist on vacation, quietly sleeping in the hot spring. Crack, crack. It was the sound of soft snow being stepped on by the soles of boots. Su Li opened his eyes. Only a few moments had passed since Chun Changxing had left, and he had quietly rested in the hot spring. Chun Changxing had returned. Su Li did not turn his head. He said emotionlessly, scared. Chun Changxing did not answer him. He walked up behind him and squatted down, removing the golden needle from his finger once more. Su Li mocked, Where's your unyielding and lofty character? The junior that old man admires the most. How did he suddenly become a spineless coward? The wind is sudden and the snow is cold. The road ahead is hard to walk, and now you know fear? You actually don't distinguish between north and south, and come to ask for my Mount Li sword sex protection before continuing forward? Chun Changxing still did not pay attention to him. His finger grasped the golden needle and once again pierced it into Su Li's neck. The first time he had used the needle on Su Li, he had sensed that the golden needle was very easy to pierce in without any obstruction. But this time he did not deliberately control the needle, so Su Li naturally felt the pain. Su Li felt the pain and said angrily, You little bastard, what do you want to do? Chun Changxing still ignored him. He took out a few medicinal herbs that he had just dug up in the snowy mountains, ground them into powder, and applied it to Su Li's wound. Then he looked around, picked up the gown that Su Li had taken off, tore it into strips, and carefully bandaged it for him. What are you doing? Su Li was very angry and scolded. Could it be that you little bastard think that I'm injured and can't walk, that I need you to take care of me? Chun Changxing still ignored him. He lowered his head and did his own thing. Su Li felt that this matter was too absurd. He was so angry that he laughed. Do you know who I am? And who are you? Do I need a piece of trash like you to take care of me? Chun Changxing spoke, but it was not a reply. He looked at the terrifying wounds on Su Li's body and furrowed his brow. He was somewhat angry and said to himself, If I hadn't lost so many things in the Garden of Zhou, these wounds would be much easier to treat. Su Li was truly anxious. He was prepared to let loose a torrent of abuse. But Chun Changxing took out a medicinal herb and stuffed it into his mouth, forcing all the profanities back down. Woo-woo-woo-woo-woo. With great difficulty, Suli swallowed the medicinal herb into his stomach. He said angrily, "You mother of asterisk cur, if I could move, I would definitely hack you in half. Even old man Een wouldn't dare to be so rude to me. I and Tian Hai could even talk cheerfully and wittily. You actually dare to treat me like this." Chun Chongsheng was truly angry. He said, "Senior, how can you be so insensible? I'm treating your wounds. Can't you be a little quieter?" As a result, Su Li became quiet. He looked at the slowly drifting snowflakes in the air and remained silent for a very long time. Suddenly he asked, "I didn't act well." So everything just now was fake, it was all an act. Su Li knew that it was difficult for him to move with his heavy injuries, and the demon army was chasing after him. He did not want to be a burden to Qin Changsheng, so he used those methods to purposefully anger him so that he could leave first. Qin Changsheng's body slightly stiffened. After a moment of silence, he said, "It's pretty good." Su Li gave a self-deprecating laugh and said tiredly, "Then how did you see it?" "I actually didn't see it." Qin Changsheng hesitated for a while, then honestly said, "I don't like being wronged, so just now I was really angry. I felt that Senior was too tyrannical, too unreasonable, Su Li coughed twice and said with a smile, "too lowly." Chen Chongqing did not dare to repeat this word. He said in a low voice, "In short, it's a little disrespectful." Su Li's smile gradually faded. He asked, "Then why did you come back?" Chun Chongqing said, "Because Senior's injuries really are very heavy." He said these words very normally, because to him, it really was a very normal thing. But to Su Li was very abnormal. In other words, you hate me very much, your pride is very hurt, and you're in a hurry to leave, but because you hate me very much and my injuries are too heavy, so you came back to save me? Chun Chongqing said nothing. At this moment, he already knew that Su Li's loathsome words and actions were all intentional. Naturally, he no longer felt any anger, only moved. What was the true demeanor of a senior? It was not immortal or Tao. It was not an invincible hero. It was not fighting against the heavens and the earth. This was the demeanor of a senior, even if it was very lowly. Chun Chongqing, once again, carried Su Li out of the hot spring and carried him on his back. He did not forget to pick up the yellow paper umbrella. Behind him, Su Li sighed ruefully. "Ah, Chun Chongqing, if you continue to be this good, I don't know if that girl you're on will make things difficult for you. But I really will be in a very difficult situation." Just as he had said before, everyone knew that Qiu Shanjun was his most beloved junior. These words unquestionably expressed Su Li's admiration for Chun Chongqing. Chun Chongqing was rather embarrassed and felt rather awkward. He wanted to find something to say to diffuse this atmosphere, but he suddenly saw the yellow paper umbrella in his hand and said, "The reason I came back, besides Senior's injuries being too heavy, is also because I remembered that I left the umbrella here." Su Li said in displeasure, "This is my umbrella. How could you forget it here?" Chun Chongqing seriously said, "Senior, this umbrella was gifted to me by the Tang old master." Su Li was very angry. "This is my umbrella." Chun Chongqing laughed and did not continue to argue. He said, "Wait until we leave the demon domain, then we'll talk." Saying this, he carried Su Li on his back and walked out of the snowy mountains. In a short while, the wind and snow concealed their figures. I'm late by 10-odd minutes, so I wrote a few hundred more characters. I finished this paragraph without leaving any loose ends. Actually, there are times when I'm rather proud of what I've written. It's full of positive energy. Chapter 356. Senior, if you wanted me to leave, you could have just said it. Why did you have to do so many things? Intentionally provoke me and trick me? I, Su Li, naturally have my reasons for doing things. Do I still need to explain it to you? Fine. Senior, who is the old man, Een, you spoke of just now? The Pope. Ah, is His Holiness the Pope surnamed Een? Don't you think it's very idiotic? Senior, I don't think so. Then you mean to blame me. Senior, on the snowy plains, I really thought that you would continue fighting. The demon lord, 10 some demon generals, Black Robe, and that abnormal demon commander hiding somewhere waiting and still fighting? You think I'm stupid, but before you attacked, you really were very heroic. I really didn't think that you would run away. Soldiers walk the path of deceit. Then, what is the soul of the path of the sword? I don't know. The soul of the path of the sword lies in the word sword. Chen Chongqing carried Su Li through the snowstorm and traversed the mountains and ridges. At this point, the conversation was finally unable to continue. He felt very tired and also very depressed. And because he was depressed, he felt even more tired. He thought to himself, we're both fleeing, but why is the difference between this and carrying Lady Chu Jian in the garden of Zhou so great? The tens of thousands of demon soldiers divided into countless streams of iron, advancing from Shuelao City to the wastelands to the south. Given enough time, the demon army could definitely overturn an area of several hundred li in circumference. Yet Black Robe watched the demon army vanish into the snowstorm without the slightest hint of relaxation. At this moment, the snowy plains began to tremble. The snow that had been crushed by the pressure of experts and terrifying sword intent for several nights instantly became much softer. With a heavy sound, a massive monster slowly walked out of the snowstorm. It had a long mouth and coiled horns, and was incomparably vicious. It was the mountain-toppling fiend, ranked third on the ranking of earthly beasts. This mountain-toppling fiend was extremely massive, much more majestic than the one in the Garden of Zhou. It was more than 40 zhang tall. A demon sat between the horns of the mountain-toppling fiend. This demon was thin and small, even smaller than an ordinary human child. Compared to the massive mountain-toppling fiend, it was minuscule. But for some reason, beneath this demon, the mountain-toppling fiend was extremely docile and docile. The demon wore a suit of armor that covered its entire body, including its face. The surface of the armor was covered in complex designs woven from golden threads, like sunflowers and also like the most popular color graffiti in Shuelao City. At the edge of these golden designs were many dark, green objects, difficult to tell if they were gems or copper rust. A terrifying and tyrannical qi seeped out from the chinks in the demon's armor. A pair of eyes like icicles pierced through the helmet and rested on the snowy plains several dozen zhang below on Black Robe. At the same time, his voice descended. His voice was like a perfectly straight metal thread without any rise or fall. But this thread was strung with countless broken gongs. Each word he spat out was like the striking of a broken gong, extremely grating. Based on your calculations, this assassination plan was absolutely foolproof, which was why His Majesty agreed to your plan. Now, the divine race has paid such a massive price. My little Heidi has lost an arm, but that person has escaped. I really want to know, just where is this foolproof plan you speak of? How do you intend to explain this to His Majesty and me? In the mouth of this demon, the terrifying and powerful second demon, General Heidi, was his little Heidi. He was naturally the commander of the demon army, the rumored #1 expert beneath the demon lord in the snowy plains of the land of demons, the demon commander. Black Robe had an extremely lofty and special status in the demon race. Although he was not a demon, he was deeply trusted by the demon lord and had once performed immortal feats for the demon race. This was also because the entire continent knew how terrifying his methods were. Whether it was humans or demons, he seemed to be able to understand all secrets and grasp all emotions. All the important figures of the demon race that had once tried to sow discord between him and the demon lord had ultimately died under his seemingly casual response. By now, there was no longer anyone in Shuelao City who dared to question Black Robe's existence, much less show him the slightest disrespect. Only the demon commander was an exception. This was because the demon commander was also deeply trusted by the demon lord and extremely powerful. More importantly, for some reason, Black Robe was very patient with the demon commander. But today, Black Robe did not have too much patience. He ignored him and quietly gazed at the snowstorm in the south in silence. The cold wind lifted up a corner of black robe, revealing a slightly green chin. In the past several hundred years, this was the first time Black Robe had specifically laid out a plan to kill a human expert. He had calculated it 37 times, and Su Li was certain to die. But who could have imagined that Su Li would ultimately succeed in escaping? His plan that had never failed seemed to have been broken for the first time. The person who broke this plan was not the Pope, not the Divine Empress, not the White Emperor couple, but that youth called Qin Changsheng. Whether it was Black Robe or the demon generals, they only needed to move their fingers to crush Qin Changsheng to death. But it just so happened that this unremarkable little fellow had changed the direction of history. Black Robe was extremely clear on Qin Changsheng's background. So in this plan of the Garden of Zhou, he had never thought of killing Qin Changsheng. It was just that Su Li had appeared too early, and Qin Changsheng had been carrying that umbrella. So he had not had the time to pass on his will to the demons that had infiltrated the Garden of Zhou. Most importantly, he had not expected Qin Changsheng to mature even faster than everyone had imagined. Would the plan of the Garden of Zhou end with Black Robe's failure? No, Black Robe did not think this way. As long as Su Li did not return to the human world, or more accurately, as long as Su Li did not return to Mount Li with his heavy injuries, as long as he did not return to Mount Li, this plan was still in progress. Just like he had once said to Su Li on this continent, there were far too many people that wanted Su Li dead. For different reasons, countless people hoped that he would die earlier. The demons were like this, and many people in the human world were also like this. It was just that Su Li was too strong, so no one dared to try and kill him. And now, Su Li had already been heavily injured by the demons. Then those powers in the human world would welcome their opportunity. This sort of reasoning sounded rather inconceivable, as if the demons and humans were joining hands. But Black Robe was very clear that this was an extremely likely reality, because many years ago, this sort of thing had already happened once. Black Robe calmly gazed in the southwest direction of the snowy plains. The cold wind gradually grew stronger. His eyes slightly narrowed, slender, and delicate, yet they contained a cold and complicated emotion. He thought of that Mount Li disciple and could not help but sigh. Hatred was truly the most interesting thing in the world. It could turn a young lady whose hands did not touch the water of spring into a demon whose hands were stained with blood, and it could also turn a disciple of a prestigious sect into a genius schemer. He did not know what other pleasant surprises that Mount Li disciple would bring. Thinking about it this way, even if Su Li could successfully return to Mount Li, the story of the Garden of Zhou would still not end. He raised his left hand and extended it into a glacier 10-odd li away, clawing at it from afar. With a boom, the glacier suddenly ruptured. Countless sharp pieces of ice, suffused with a faint blue color, danced in the air. At the same time, a petite figure flew out. It was Nank, her eyes tightly closed and on her last breath. Her light green wings wrapped tightly around her body. Black Robe grabbed her, and without paying any attention to the mountainous, mountain-toppling fiend and the demon commander, he walked into the depths of the snowstorm. It was still spring in Hanqiu City, so it naturally did not snow. However, it was extremely cold this morning. The forest outside the city was covered in a chill. The dew that had just formed on the green leaves did not take long to freeze into beads of ice. They rolled down the leaves with a dense clatter. The reason for this strange phenomenon was that the qi of the world behind the forest was extremely chaotic. The main gate of the Garden of Zhou could faintly be seen in the fog, but it was still tightly shut. The rainbow that had come from Mount Li tens of thousands of li away, with the assistance of the Orthodoxy's great array, was constantly attempting to open the gate. Even nature was responding. Cultivators were everywhere in and out of the forest. There were priests from the Li Palace, teachers from various sects and academies, and naturally, there were also the city guards of Hanqiu City. There were also the noble clans of Tianliang County, represented by Zhu Luo. It was a dense mass, yet no one made a sound. Everyone had extremely solemn expressions. Time slowly passed. As the morning sun broke through the clouds on the horizon, Hanqiu City was illuminated, and the rainbow also seemed to grow somewhat brighter. "It's open." In the deepest part of the forest, in front of the thick fog, a priest of the Li Palace excitedly shouted. Following this shout, the area immediately became noisy. Many people surged towards the garden gate that was slowly opening in the fog. The vast majority of them had no way of entering the Garden of Zhou, but if they were a bit closer, it would be easier to receive them later on. Now that everyone knew that the closing of the Garden of Zhou was a scheme of the demons, were the disciples that had entered the Garden of Zhou to train well. Not long after, a cultivator rushed out of the Garden of Zhou. He seemed extremely panicked, and only when he saw his master did he finally relax and almost cry. Soon after, more and more cultivators walked out of the Garden of Zhou. They were all in rather sorry and miserable states, but in the end they had all survived. The priests of the Li Palace and the officials of the court stood to the side, carefully recording the number of people that had left the Garden of Zhou. There were even more workers who, ignoring the fact that some of the young cultivators were still in a state of shock, went up and asked for their sect and name, and then counted how many people had not yet left the Garden of Zhou. The forest was filled with sounds of panic. Zhu Luo and Mei Li Sha stood outside the forest, listening to the reports of the priests and officials, their expressions becoming more and more serious. From the descriptions of the cultivators that had left the Garden of Zhou, their previous conjecture had been confirmed. It was the worst kind of conjecture. The Garden of Zhou was about to be destroyed. Time continued to pass, and more people escaped the Garden of Zhou. But according to the records of the Li Palace priests and officials, there were still some people that had not come out. Mei Li Sha looked at the gate in the thick fog that was becoming fainter and fainter. He could feel the qi that was becoming more and more chaotic, and his eyes became colder and colder. Qin Changsheng still had not come out. Zhu Luo looked at the carriage on the official road outside the forest, and his expression relaxed slightly. That carriage belonged to the 13 divisions of Radiant Green. The windows were covered with a blue curtain, and the interior could not be seen. Su Yurong sat by the window and said nothing. She was waiting for someone to come out. Previously, the scene of Qin Changsheng unleashing 10,000 swords at the mausoleum of Zhou has been drawn by Dewar. The angle of view is unique, and the image is awesome. In a moment, I will post it on WeChat. Everyone is welcome to take a look. Afterwards, I will continue writing. I will try to post the next chapter before 11. Also, Butterfly Blue wants me to tell everyone that he is about to update as well. I will trouble everyone to tell him. Silence. Chapter 357. Su Yurong looked out the window without saying a word. She waited for that person to come out of the Garden of Zhou. Although the blue curtain on the window was down, it could not block her view. Time continued to mercilessly pass. The sun slowly rose, and the light of the sky gradually moving from the walls of Hanqiu City to the official road until it illuminated the entire world. It also passed through the curtain and shone into the carriage, falling on her face and causing it to grow paler and paler. After leaving the Garden of Zhou, the first thing she did was tell Bishop Mei Li Sha and Zhu Luo what had happened inside. The sky of the Garden of Zhou was collapsing. The reason why these people had the time to leave was because there was a youth on the mausoleum of Zhou in the plains, using an umbrella to hold up the sky. They had to think of a way to save him as soon as possible. If she were not Su Yurong, Mei Li Sha and Zhu Luo would definitely think she had gone crazy. However, even if she were Su Yurong and Mei Li Sha and Zhu Luo believed her, they still had no way of saving that youth who was holding up the sky above the mausoleum of Zhou. Only those at ethereal opening could enter the Garden of Zhou. Moreover, just as she had said, if they wanted to save that youth, they needed an expert of an even higher cultivation. Perhaps Zhu Luo had this ability, but the Garden of Zhou was currently collapsing and extremely unstable. As long as he walked into the Garden of Zhou, that miniature world might instantly be destroyed. No one could save the young man, only the young man himself. So Su Yurong couldn't do anything but wait for him. At this moment, a senior sister from the 13 divisions of Radiant Green hurried over to the window and said to her through the blue curtain, "There's no one called Su Sheng, and I've also investigated. No one from the Snow Mountain sect has come this year." Su Yurong was silent for a while, then asked, "How many people have not come out?" 40-something people. The senior sister from the 13 divisions of Radiant Green hesitated for a while, then said in a low voice, "The Orthodox Academy's Chen Chongxing has also not come out." As she said this, she was very worried about Su Yurong's situation. She thought that Su Yurong was worried about her fiancé's safety, so she had asked her to investigate these matters. However, Su Yurong did not have any reaction, which made her rather surprised. The person Su Yurong was waiting for was not Qin Chongsheng. There was no disciple of the Snow Mountain sect, Su Sheng, on the register of cultivators that had entered the Garden of Zhou. However, she was keenly aware that this disciple of the Snow Mountain sect, Su Sheng, was in the Garden of Zhou. Moreover, he was currently on the mausoleum of Zhou, holding up the great umbrella of 10,000 swords. Entering the Garden of Zhou and using an alias, even changing sex with the tacit approval of the Li Palace, was a very common thing. In her view, since Su Sheng was a genius disciple of the secret sect that the Snow Mountain sect had placed its hopes on, it was very likely that he had entered the Garden of Zhou with a different identity like her, and could not be found on the register. In reality, she had never hoped to see that youth's name on the register. After leaving the Garden of Zhou, she sat silently by the window of the carriage, looking at every person that walked out of the mist from the depths of the forest or was carried out. She was very sure that she did not miss a single person, because she did not even blink. She saw many senior and junior brothers from the Longevity sect, saw a few fellow disciples from the South Stream Temple, saw those injured people that she had treated at night, saw that wolf youth that had knocked down 4 trees while carrying Qi Jian on his back, and yet she did not see him. Finally, several figures supported each other as they walked out of the mist. Then, an unimaginably terrifying Qi exploded from the mist. The rainbow that had fallen into the mist instantly began to tremble uneasily, as if it would break at any moment. At the same time, the magnificent courtyard of the Garden of Zhou that was faintly discernible in the mist suddenly twisted into countless images, as if they were about to disappear. Seeing the scene, Mei Lisha became even older. Zhu Luo floated up and flew into the sky above the mist. When the rainbow finally broke, a bright and beautiful sword glow-chopped down from his hand onto the ground. It immediately formed an incomparably powerful barrier, separating the world behind the mist from the real world. There was a massive boom, which echoed for several hundred li around Hanqiu City. Even though Zhu Luo was one of the storms of the 8 directions, one of the strongest experts of the continent, this sword strike that he had slashed down with all his strength was actually unable to completely seal off the sputtering of that powerful qi. A hurricane swept up the green leaves and earth, roiling towards the forest. It whistled without end, instantly swallowing up the official road. Only when it collided with the sturdy walls of Hanqiu City did it finally stop. The wind stopped, the dust settled, and the world regained its clarity. The forest was filled with groans and coughs. Everyone looked behind the forest and saw that the thick mist had already dispersed. However, the green mountain that should have been behind the mist had actually disappeared without a trace. The gate to the Garden of Zhou had disappeared, and the Garden of Zhou had also disappeared. It was unknown whether or not there would be anyone who would be able to open the gate to the Garden of Zhou in the future. Even if it could be opened, it was already meaningless. Before the collapse of the Garden of Zhou, the energy that had seeped out had directly transformed into a real green mountain. How could the Garden of Zhou still exist? The forest was absolutely silent, Those startled birds had been shaken to death by the qi that had sprayed out when the Garden of Zhou had been annihilated, dying stiffly amongst the fallen leaves and earth. The silence was broken by sorrowful weeping. The teachers of many sects and academies wore sorrowful expressions, and there were also many young cultivators who knelt beside the corpses of their schoolmates and fellow disciples, weeping without end. The priests and officials of the Li Palace collected their thoughts, and once again began to count. They confirmed that of the human cultivators that had entered the Garden of Zhou, there were still 27 people who had not come out. However, they did not know whether those people had long since died to the schemes of the demons, or whether they had lost their lives in the destruction of the Garden of Zhou. At this moment in the forest there were still 10-odd corpses. The curtains were covered in a thick layer of dust, blocking out the light and also blocking out the line of sight. This caused Su Yorong's face to darken somewhat. She closed her eyes, her long eyelashes gently blinking. She did not say anything. Her right hand lightly stroked the pheasant at her side, trembling slightly. "Let's go," she whispered. The carriage of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green followed the official road into the distance. The wind on the official road blew the dirt off the curtains. She could see the scene on the side of the road. Those injured, lying on stretchers, were all moaning. This made her somewhat sad. In the first few nights of the Garden of Zhou, she and Qin Chongsheng had never met. They had constantly saved people. These injured people were saved by them together. As for Qin Chongsheng, he also did not leave the Garden of Zhou. Only now did she understand a fact. The young Taoist on the other end of the letter from several years ago had also died. She had originally thought that she would not feel sad because of him, but now she realized that she still felt somewhat sad. If not for this engagement, he would not have come to the capital, would not have participated in the grand examination, would not have entered the Orthodox Academy, and would not have come to the Garden of Zhou. Naturally, he would not have died. He should still be in that old temple in Xining village, facing the 3,000 scriptures of the way every day, right? She had originally forgotten about those letters, but now, for some reason, she suddenly remembered that Qin Chongsheng had once said in the letters that he had to memorize the scriptures every day. It made him feel very tired, but no matter how tired it was still better than dying now, no? The wheels of the carriage rolled over the official road, giving off a rumbling sound. This was parting. Everyone had to learn how to part. Parting always made people sad. Even if she was Su Yorong, she was still only a 15-year-old girl. What made her most sad was that the person she was waiting for, in the end, still did not appear. "Are you really called Su Sheng? Are you really a disciple of the Snow Mountain sect? Do you still not know that I am called Su Yorong? Does anyone know that we once stood shoulder to shoulder in the grasslands, went through life and death together, quietly facing each other? Perhaps your family and teachers will grieve for you, but I do not even have the right to grieve. This is a truly sorrowful matter." Not long after the carriage of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green left, in the forest outside Hanqiu City, another sorrowful matter occurred. Someone was about to die. In this year's opening of the Garden of Zhou, because of the demon schemes, the human cultivators had suffered disastrous casualties. Logically speaking, death was a very normal matter. But the person who was about to die was Liang Xiaoxiao of the Mount Li Sword sect. This matter was no longer normal. It was very sorrowful. Then, this sorrow would very quickly transform into anger, because everyone present believed that the one who killed Liang Xiaoxiao was not a demon, but Jishyo. See you tomorrow. Chapter 358. The carriage of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green left, but the female disciples stayed behind. They, the disciples of South Stream Temple, and the priests of the Li Palace treated the injured in the forest. The cultivation world was currently in a season of blooming wildflowers, and this year's grand examination was even more of a big year. Coupled with the starlight from the Mausoleum of Books, there were actually several dozen young cultivators who had not yet reached the age of 20, who had overcome the barrier of life and death and successfully entered ethereal opening. The future of the human world seemed incomparably bright, but who could have imagined that such a major incident would occur in the Garden of Zhou? Whether it was the orthodoxy, the imperial court, or the sects of the south, they were all naturally incomparably nervous. Fortunately, the injuries on the bodies of the injured were not too serious. The majority of them had been injured by the falling rocks while escaping the Garden of Zhou. After some simple treatment, they were no longer in any danger. There were also several dozen cultivators who had been heavily injured by the demon experts in the first 2 nights. They had already received treatment from Su Yorong and Qin Changshen, so they were no longer in any danger. Amongst these people, Qi Jian's injuries were the most serious. That treacherous sword had directly pierced through her abdomen, shaking off several of her meridians. In addition to the several dozen days and nights of fleeing and the effects of medicine, she was still unconscious. It was unknown when she would wake up. The Mount Li elder who was watching over her had an extremely unsightly expression. With the Mount Li teacher taking care of Qi Jian, Zhishio naturally could not get too close, but he did not go too far either. He stood under a scholar tree nearby, his eyes closed. Compared to the noisy and chaotic forest, he seemed very lonely. In reality, he had also suffered extremely heavy injuries, especially since the poison that Nank had planted in his body had already spread. However, he did not ask the priests of the Li Palace to treat his injuries. His slightly pale face showed no expression. Not only did he keep people at a distance of 1,000 li, the other human cultivators also did not take the initiative to ask about him due to the rumors related to him. The Mount Li elder turned his head and glanced at Zhishio. His eyes were filled with inquiry and vigilance, as if he wanted to ask something. However, in the end, he turned his head again and returned his attention to the heavily injured and unconscious Qi Jian. As the last disciple of the Mount Li sword sect master, Qi Jian's status was naturally different. As soon as she left the Garden of Zhou, 2 cardinals of the Li Palace had already carefully examined her and confirmed that her life was not in danger. However, her injuries were extremely severe, especially her severed meridians and her coma. They could not think of any good methods to treat her, so they had to bring her back to the capital or Mount Li as soon as possible. That Mount Li elder knew of Qi Jian's past and was even more uneasy. If she really was so heavily injured that she could not get up, who knew what kind of madness his martial uncle would have? And what made him most uneasy, and even somewhat afraid, was the sword wound in her lower abdomen. Swords had sword intent, and sword wounds would often have remnants of sword intent. Mount Li cultivated the sword, so this elder only needed a glance to sense where the sword that had heavily injured Qi Jian had come from. Just as he was feeling uneasy, several cries and shouts suddenly came from the depths of the forest. "Someone come, quickly!" This Mount Li elder turned around and saw the scene. His expression suddenly changed, and he could no longer care about Qi Jian. He ordered the disciples to take good care of her and rushed over himself. With a flick of his sleeve, he shook off the surrounding crowd and angrily yelled, "What's going on here?" In the center of the crowd was a stretcher, and the person lying on the stretcher was Liang Xiaoxiao. Liang Xiaoxiao had actually been heavily injured for some reason. His body had over 10 wounds made by the edge of a sword. 2 female disciples of the South Stream Temple were helping him bandage them, but they could not stop the blood from flowing out from beneath the bandages. The scene was extremely cruel. His face was as white as paper, his lips were blue, his eyes were dim, and his qi was weak. The once valiant and formidable-looking young genius was now only a hair's breadth away from death. The 2 female disciples of the South Stream Temple squatted at the 2 sides of the stretcher, constantly using bandages to try and staunch the bleeding. However, they could not stop the bleeding, and they could not help but panic. One of the slightly younger female disciples even began to cry, sobbing, "Senior Liang, you can't have anything happen to you." The forest was deathly still, and the crowd was shocked speechless. Liang Xiaoxiao was not an ordinary cultivator. He was an inner disciple of the Mount Li sword sect, one of the divine state 7 laws, and first upon the first banner in last year's grand examination. Yet now he was actually about to die. What was going on? Who had injured him? A cardinal of the Lee Palace hurriedly rushed over. Seeing the scene before him, he could not help but be greatly alarmed. Without hesitation, he used the sacred light technique, and without any hesitation, he sprinkled clear light onto Liang Xiaoxiao's body. The scene was silent, and the crowd anxiously waited. After a while, the bleeding on Liang Xiaoxiao's body stopped, but his face was still pale, and his eyes were still dim. The cardinal slowly shook his head. Seeing the expression on the cardinal's face, the Mountly Elder's body slightly swayed, and he forced himself to stand. Through the narration of some of the people present, he knew that Liang Xiaoxiao had been carried out by Zhuang Huanyu in the end. He coldly looked over. What's going on? Zhuang Huanyu also had several sword wounds on his body, but they were not serious. His face was also very pale, but it was probably not because of his wounds, but because his mind was agitated. Hearing the Mountly Elder's question, he looked at Liang Xiaoxiao on the stretcher and was somewhat hesitant. Liang Xiaoxiao lay on the stretcher. His spirit was slightly better than before, and his qi was slightly stronger. However, when the sunlight sprinkled down, one could faintly see that on the surface of his clothes there were some fragments of glass. It was a sign that his cultivation was dispersing. This divine state's 3rd law was about to die. The forest became even more deathly still, and the sorrow gradually thickened. The girl from South Stream Temple began to cry again. The Mountly Elder looked at Zhuang Huanyu and roared, "Speak!" With this roar, a sword intent exploded forth, enveloping Zhuang Huanyu. It seemed that if Zhuang Huanyu had been a little slower, that sword intent would have directly chopped him into pieces. Zhuang Huanyu was also not a normal cultivator. He was a student of the Heavenly Academy. However, at this moment, this Mountly Elder did not care about this at all, and it could be seen how angry he was. As the host of the opening of the Garden of Zhou, Zhu Luo had already arrived. Naturally, he could not just watch Zhuang Huanyu die like this. He looked at the Mountly Elder and said, "Calm down." At this moment, a weak voice came from the stretcher. "Martial uncle, it has nothing to do with Master Huanyu." The Mountly Elder looked at Liang Xiaoxiao and said with a slightly trembling voice, "Then who injured you like this?" At this moment, the majority of the people in the forest believed that the demon experts that had infiltrated the Garden of Zhou had heavily injured Liang Xiaoxiao. It must be known that Liang Xiaoxiao was first upon the first banner in last year's grand examination, and had also viewed the monoliths in the Mausoleum of Books for an entire year. His cultivation was extremely profound, and logically only those demon experts could injure him like this. However, the Mountly Elder was very clear that Liang Xiaoxiao was not injured by demons, because he recognized the sword scars on Liang Xiaoxiao's body. Those sword scars were just like the one on Qi Jian's abdomen. They were all sword techniques of Mountly. The Mountly sword sect disciples that had entered the Garden of Zhou were only Qi Jian and Liang Xiaoxiao. The Mountly Elder had a vague guess, but he could not believe it, so his voice trembled very much. Liang Xiaoxiao looked at his martial uncle, and slowly but firmly shook his head. The Mountly Elder understood his meaning, and his face revealed an expression of disbelief. Liang Xiaoxiao was in a state of terminal lucidity, and his spirit was better than before. His gaze slowly moved, and when he saw Qi Jian in the distance, he imperceptibly paused, and then continued moving. Only the Mountly Elder and Zhu Luo noticed this, and they also saw that Liang Xiaoxiao's gaze towards Qi Jian was filled with self-blame, frustration, heartache, and sorrow. Everyone's gazes followed his gaze, and they vaguely understood what he was looking for. Finally, Liang Xiaoxiao's gaze fell on a scholar tree. Under the scholar tree was the wolf tribe youth. Countless gazes fell on his body. Zheshio's eyes were closed, as if he had not sensed anything. "It's him." Zhuang Huanyu's voice was somewhat hoarse as he said, Wo Fuzhishio is a spy for the demons. In the garden of Zhou, he ambushed us. In order to save me, Senior Liang was taken advantage of by him. Hearing these words, the forest was first deathly silent, and then it exploded into an uproar. I'm truly sorry. According to the plan, I should have written 6,000 characters today. I definitely shouldn't have stopped here. But there really are too many things to do, and my condition is too terrible. Tomorrow, if my body is fine, I will definitely write more. In this story, Liang Xiaoxiao is a supporting character, or even a minor character. However, I am very serious about writing him, so I'm sorry again. In addition, a while ago, I reported to everyone that the book review area is holding a long-term welfare event. Readers who cast 2 or more monthly votes this month, or readers who cast 20 or more recommendation votes this month, will have the opportunity to receive 10,000 book coins and a set of Choosing Heaven's Diary signature. Everyone can pay attention to the book review at the top of the book review area. The promised book review area welfare is here. Reply to participate. Chapter 359. The forest was silent. Countless gazes fell on Jeshio, each with different emotions. Zhu Luo slightly squinted his eyes, thinking about something. Mei Lisha was not there at all. In front of the Green Mountain, he stared at the garden of Zhou that had already disappeared. His aged face was filled with an indescribable expression. So that's how it is. The Mountly elder looked at Jeshio and said expressionlessly. Footsteps and the sound of rushing wind could be heard from the forest. The cultivators of the Southern Longevity Sect and Holy Maiden Peak did not wait for orders to be given. They spread out, vaguely blocking off all possible routes that Jeshio could take. Based on the situation, they would strike at the very next moment. Logically, there was no reason for everyone to firmly believe Zhuang Huanyu's accusation that Jeshio was a demon spy. The problem was that Liang Xiaoxiao, who was on the stretcher, stared at Jeshio without concealing the hatred and vigilance in his eyes. Moreover, he did not say a word of objection. Liang Xiaoxiao was one of the Divine Kingdom's 7 laws, and Zhuang Huanyu was a proud disciple of the heavenly Tao Academy. The testimonies of these 2 people were very powerful, and the most important thing was that Liang Xiaoxiao was severely wounded, and his true essence was scattered. He was about to die, and no one would doubt his words. Who would lie at the moment of death? Jeshio was not a human cultivator, and had no relations with the many cultivation sects of the Central Plains. However, he had killed demons on the snowy plains, cooperated with the great Zhou army, and achieved many military merits. Many nobles in the capital admired him. In essence, it was an exchange of benefits and considerations, but it did not prevent people from wanting to help him. The status of the Li Palace was relatively high. The cardinal who had just treated Liang Xiaoxiao slightly frowned. He thought that the sword wounds on Liang Xiaoxiao's body did not seem to be the method Jishio used to kill. He hesitated and said, I think the most fatal should be the sword wounds. An instructor of the Star Caesar Academy looked at Zhuang Huanyu with a cold expression and said, Correct, how do you explain that? Jishio has achieved military merits time and time again, and killed who knows how many demons on the snowy plains. You actually say that he colluded with the demons to kill people in the garden of Zhou. How can anyone believe that? It was indeed so, especially the sword wounds on Liang Xiaoxiao's body. They clearly did not come from Jishio's hands. This question was even more fatal. Many people once again looked towards Zhuang Huanyu, wanting to hear how he would explain. After a moment of hesitation, Zhuang Huanyu said, Perhaps he had been concealing himself all these years and wanted to use those military achievements to win the trust of us humans. The accusation of colluding with the demon race cannot be used with the word, or... The instructor of the Star Taker Academy said bluntly. He did not care about his identity at all. Zhuang Huanyu's eyes were slightly red. It was unknown whether it was because of anxiety or anger. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he didn't. He seemed to subconsciously look towards the stretcher. Liang Xiaoxiao shook her head with difficulty and said, "Don't say it." Upon seeing this scene, the Mountly elder vaguely understood that his conjecture had become true. His complexion became extremely pale, and his body shivered. Hearing Liang Xiaoxiao's weak voice, Zhuang Huanyu tightly shut his mouth. His face was pale, and his body was slightly cold. However, his coldness was not the same as that Mountly elder's coldness. Looking at the blood-covered Liang Xiaoxiao on the stretcher, thinking of the previous conversation in the garden of Zhou, as well as the several dozen mournful sword glows, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. At the time, outside the mountainside Whispering Wood, Liang Xiaoxiao saw the scene of Zhixiu carrying Qi Jian out of the garden of Zhou. He very calmly gave a few instructions to Zhuang Huanyu. Then, without any warning or hesitation, he unsheathed his sword from its sheath and displayed an extremely powerful sword move. That sword move was the last move of the Mountly sword style. It was the most heroic and decisive. Using this sword move could bring the greatest harm to the enemy, but it would also mean that the user would die under this move. Back in the grand examination, the reason why Go Hanshi had withdrawn from the battle was because he saw that Chen Changsheng had decided to use this sword move. Liang Xiaoxiao had used this cold and tragic move on his own body. Zhuang Huanyu was stupefied. He had never seen such a cold and cruel person. If he was so cold and cruel to himself, then how could he be so cruel to others? Yes, this was a scheme that Liang Xiaoxiao had come up with on the spur of the moment. He used his death and those sword wounds to accuse Zhixiu and Qi Jian of colluding with the demons and harming their fellow disciples. He did not say Qi Jian's name in front of so many people, because he was a Mountly disciple who loved his fellow disciples and valued the reputation of the sect above his own life. Even if he was about to die, he did not want Mount Li's clean reputation to be tarnished. He still felt pity for his junior, and it was precisely because he was such a person that his words were all the more trustworthy. Using his own death to exchange for benefits, Liang Xiaoxiao was truly very frightening. The most frightening thing was, before he made this decision, he did not have the slightest hesitation. Moreover, it was clear that he did not care whether Zhuang Huanyu would act according to his plan or not. Liang Xiaoxiao had used his own death to weave a conspiracy, causing Zhuang Huanyu to be incomparably terrified. He wanted to escape, but he knew that he couldn't escape. From the moment that Chen Changsheng's group of 3 had been assassinated by Liang Xiaoxiao and the demon race's experts at the lakeside, and from the moment that he hadn't appeared, he had walked onto a wrong path. In the past, there were many moments where he had the opportunity to correct his path, including now. He could have said the truth of the matter, but he would be a coward if he did that, so he did not. Afterwards, he had to continue on this path, unable to turn back. It seemed that from the very beginning his opponent had already calculated what his choice would be. Looking at the blood-covered, dying Liang Xiaoxiao on the stretcher, Zhuang Huanyu felt that he was looking at a demon. Liang Xiaoxiao was also looking at him. His eyes were somewhat gloomy but very calm. When their gazes met, everything became a foregone conclusion. Zhuang Huanyu was silent. He slowly lowered his head and said with a slightly trembling voice, "I'm sorry, I can't say anything." In the eyes of the crowd, Zhuang Huanyu appeared to be very sad, but also very unwilling. He could not say anything, but in reality he had already said a lot, and it was even more terrifying than saying it out loud. Zhu Luo slightly raised his eyebrows and looked at the crowd, at the still unconscious Qi Jian. Qi Jian had no idea what had happened. "What do you have to say?" The new instructor of the Heavenly Academy came to the scene. Hearing the situation, his expression was slightly cold, and he looked at Zhixiu under the locust tree and asked. Zhixiu expressionlessly said, "Liang Xiaoxiao was a spy of the demons, but I did not kill him." The scene was once again in an uproar. The Mountly elder said with a cold expression, "What did you say?" Zhixiu recounted what had happened by the lake. He was not good with words, so he spoke very slowly, but it was precisely because of this that his story was somewhat believable. The Star Caesar Academy instructor asked, "What you said, do you have any witnesses?" Zheshio and Liang Xiaoxiao accused each other of being a spy of the demons, but there was naturally no evidence, so they could only seek witnesses. At this moment, there were not many people present who believed Zheshio's words. The words of the Star Caesar Academy instructor were undoubtedly an opportunity that Zheshio had to grasp. After a moment of silence, Zheshio said, "I know that you will not believe my words. When Qi Jian wakes up, you will naturally understand." The cardinal met the gazes of the crowd, shook his head, and said, "His injuries are too heavy, and there are some serious problems with his meridians. I don't know when he will wake up, or even," Zhuang Huanyu sneered, and said with grief and indignation, "If he won't wake up, then." The two did not finish their words, but the crowd understood what they meant. It was possible that Qi Jian would never wake up. If this was the case, Zhuang Huanyu would feel very happy. It was still the same saying. Sometimes not saying it or not saying it thoroughly was more destructive than saying it clearly. These details, in addition to the sword wounds on Liang Xiaoxiao's body, had already made many people think that they had roughly guessed what had happened in the Garden of Zhou. They knew why Zhuang Huanyu was so indignant and wanted to say something, but stopped. They also knew why Liang Xiaoxiao was about to die, but was still unwilling to say more. According to what Zheshio said, you were not there at the time. The Star Caesar Academy instructor looked at Zhuang Huanyu and asked. Zhuang Huanyu was silent for a very long time and finally raised his head. He had made his choice, so he appeared very calm. To choose between being a coward for a lifetime and a warrior for a quarter of an hour was very easy. He had already been a coward once, so in the story he was telling, he would obviously be a warrior, even though he was very clear that this was the behavior of a coward. After listening to Zhuang Huanyu's story, the scene once again became quiet. Under the scholar tree, Zheshio felt the strange gazes from all around him, felt the pressure that was gradually solidifying. He slightly lowered his head, very confused. He was currently unable to see, so he was even more confused as to how humans could so easily lie with their eyes open. In order to cover up a lie, more lies were needed, and there would inevitably be loopholes. Zhuang Huanyu's story was completely fabricated by Liang Xiaoxiao in a very short amount of time, so it was obviously impossible to guarantee that all the details were perfect. Zhu Luo, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said, "Qin Changxing was also there?" In Zheshio's story, Chen Changxing played a very important role, but in Zhuang Huanyu's story, Chen Changxing appeared but was only mentioned in a few words. Zheshio did not understand and said, "Yes, Qin Changxing can testify." The professor of the Heavenly Academy looked at him and slightly frowned. "Qin Changxing did not leave the Garden of Zhou. He should already be dead, you know this, so you purposely said this?" Hearing that Chen Changxing had died in the Garden of Zhou, Zheshio was silent, no longer saying anything. Liang Xiaoxiao's voice became weaker and weaker. "So he did not leave the Garden of Zhou, then it's nothing." After saying this, he sighed, a little regretful, a little happy, and a little perplexed. In short, it was very complicated. The forest once again became quiet. Everyone was shocked, speechless. Could it be that Zheshio's collusion with the demons actually involved Qin Changxing? How could one weave a perfect lie? It was not to constantly use new lies to make up for it, but to be like drawing, one needed to know how to leave blank, to give people space to think. Liang Xiaoxiao did this, and it was very successful. Of course, even at this moment, this lie could not be said to be perfect, because the words of a living person were never more trustworthy than the words of a dead person. Life was the most precious thing in the world, and the accusation of life was the most powerful. Many times, it was even more weighty than the truth. If Liang Xiaoxiao died at this moment, then his framing of Zheshio, Qi Jian, and Qin Changxing could be considered perfect. He closed his eyes and smiled tiredly. His face revealed a very complicated expression: unwillingness, grief, relief, and forgiveness. Then he died. Yesterday I said that if my body was fine, I would strive to write more, but I really can't. I'm sick, so I can't write more. Fortunately, I'm quite satisfied with what I wrote. Liang Xiao is really amazing. I like him. Also, last night I also dreamed of Taiyan. Also, was the Fatties Han you written by Han Mao. Chapter 360. The Mount Li elder looked at Liang Xiao on the stretcher in silence for a very long time. Then he turned to Zhixio under the scholar tree and said emotionlessly, "What else do you have to say?" Zhixio closed his eyes and said, "Since he surrendered to the demons, anyone can kill him. If I killed him, I have no need to hide it, but I did not kill him." There was a slight disturbance in the forest. The Mount Li elder's face was like frost as he coldly said, "Martial nephew Liang is already dead. You actually dare to splash dirty water on the body of a deceased person. You are a little too shameless." Zhixio now knew for sure that Liang Xiao was dead. He roughly understood the entire matter and suddenly felt very tired. "Follow us back to Mount Li to be interrogated." The Mount Li elder looked at him like he was looking at a dead man. With his words, 10 some longevity, sect disciples surrounded Zhixio. In the surroundings, there were even more southern cultivators keeping an eye on Zhixio's movements to prevent him from suddenly attacking. At this moment, Zhu Luo expressionlessly said, "Wait." The storms of the 8 directions were the strongest experts of the human race, so their status was naturally special. His words caused even the extremely furious Mount Li elder to temporarily calm down. What I dislike the most is this sort of situation where nothing is said clearly and you want to finish the matter. Zhu Luo pointed at the unconscious Qi Jian and said, "From what you're saying, besides Zhixio, the people who killed Liang Xiao should also be Qi Jian and even Chen Changsheng." The Mount Li elder slowly said, "This is a matter of Mount Li. I ask, sir, to respect it. This is not a matter of Mount Li, but something that happened in the garden of Zhou." Zhu Luo expressionlessly said, "This year's opening of the garden of Zhou will be presided over by me. Whatever happens in there, you must let me understand." The Mount Li elder suppressed his anger and said, "Could it be that you still don't understand this matter?" "Very much so." Zhu Luo did not care for his reaction and casually said, "Zhixio has performed many military deeds for my great Zhou. You say that he colluded with the demons, but if Qi Jian also participated in this matter, could it be that he has also thrown in with the demons? He is a disciple of your Mount Li, so what reason does he have to join hands with this wolf youth to deal with his own senior brother?" The Mount Li elder thought about the meaning in Liang Xiao's gaze before his death. After a moment of silence, he walked up to Zhu Luo and whispered, "This matter involves Mount Li's clean reputation. Sir, please do not continue asking." Zhu Luo raised his eyebrows slightly. One must know that reputation and clean reputation may seem similar, but in reality, there was a hidden difference. The Mount Li elder lowered his voice and said, "Martial nephew Qi Jian, what happened between him and Zhixio, we temporarily do not know, but we absolutely cannot ask in front of everyone, because his identity is very special. Only the 2 of them could hear this conversation. Seeing him so cautious, Zhu Luo asked, "What is his identity?" After a moment of silence, the Mount Li elder said, "She is a woman." Zhu Luo looked at Zhixio under the scholar tree and seemed to understand something. He said, "No wonder you talked about clean reputation." The Mount Li elder said, "I ask for sir's understanding." Zhu Luo shook his head. "This is not enough. Mount Li's reputation is admittedly important, but it's not as important as the truth and life and death." The Mount Li elder hesitated for a while, then clenched his teeth and said, "She is Martial Uncle's daughter." Zhu Luo's expression turned slightly cold. Looking into his eyes, he asked, "Which Martial Uncle?" The Mount Li elder softly said, "Junior Martial Uncle." Hearing these 3 words, Zhu Luo fell silent for a very long time. The storms of the 8 directions had an incomparably lofty status in the human world. only below the 5 saints. Logically speaking, any name would not make him feel any fear, but there was one person that had to be eliminated here. So it was Su Li's daughter. It was actually Su Li's daughter. No wonder she had been accepted as the last disciple of the Mount Li sect master. All of Mount Li regarded her as a treasure, and even Cho Shan-jun and Go Hanchi cherished her in the palm of their hands. Looking at the unconscious Qi Jian, Zhu Luo thought of these things and shook his head. The Mount Li elder said, "Many thanks for Sir's understanding. Of course, if Qi Jian really did do something in the Garden of Zhou, with the law soared above, the discipline hall will definitely use the sect's rules. Mount Li will inform Sir of the final result as soon as possible." Zhu Luo did not say anything, silently agreeing. This truly was something that had happened in the Garden of Zhou, but the Mount Li sword sect had already spoken to this extent. Moreover, this matter involved Su Li, so even he was not willing to take responsibility for it. But at this moment, besides him, the person with the most power in words was also an old man. Following the signal of the Mount Li sword sect elder, people carried Qi Jian's and Liang Xiaoxiao's corpses away on stretchers. Zhixiu tilted his ear and heard the noise. His body slightly leaned forward, as if he wanted to do something, but in the end he did nothing. Just when the Mount Li sword sect elder was prepared to take Zhixiu away, the old man finally spoke. Ever since the destruction of the Garden of Zhou and the disappearance of the Green Mountains, Archbishop Meilisha had always been staring blankly at the thick fog. His aged face became even older, and his turbid eyes became even more turbid. He did not pay any attention to what was happening in the forest. Only now did he finally turn around. With an expressionless face, he said, "Leave him behind." The Mount Li sword sect elder said, "This is my Mount Li's. The one who died is a disciple of your Mount Li, and the one who acted seems to also be a disciple of your Mount Li. I don't care about the trivial internal affairs of your Mount Li, but what right do you have to take Zhixiu away? Just because of what Liang Xiaoxiao said before he died? Doesn't that mean that if Chen Changsheng was still alive, you would also take him back to Mount Li in front of my eyes?" Meilisha slowly walked back into the forest. Looking at the Mount Li elder, he said, "Is there such a reason?" The Mount Li elder did not say anything, but the newly appointed education overseer of the Heavenly Academy hesitantly opened his mouth. "My lord, if Chen Changxing really was involved in this matter, then perhaps we should also carefully interrogate him. If a person is dead and can no longer speak, then you can freely splash dirty water on his body? I seem to have heard someone say this before." Meilisha looked at the newly appointed education overseer of the Heavenly Academy and expressionlessly said, "As for interrogating, Chen Changxing is the principal of the Orthodox Academy. What right do you, a mere education overseer, have to interrogate him? Besides His Holiness, who has the right to interrogate him?" He glanced at Zhixiu under the scholar tree and said, "The clean reputation of your Mount Li is important, but is the reputation of my orthodoxy not important? The matter of this wolf tribe youth concerns the reputation of my orthodoxy. I want to take him back to the capital. Who has any objections?" Zhu Luo said, "I have no objections." Since he had no objections, then no one present had the right to have any objections, including those southern cultivators and the Mount Li elder who clearly had objections. Meilisha looked at the Mount Li elder and coldly said, "If Mount Li has any objections, let your sect master say it, or let Su Li say it." The Mount Li elder could no longer endure and angrily said, "The one who died is a disciple of my Mount Li. So a dead person is amazing? Could it be that because he died, this matter is not full of mistakes, a complete mess?" Meilisha's voice became even colder. "Moreover, my current mood is very bad. His Holiness's mood is also about to be very bad. The entire Orthodoxy's mood is also going to be bad, because Chen Changsheng is dead. Principal Chen Changsheng of the Orthodox Academy is dead." The old man looked at the sky outside the forest and sadly said, "What matter could be more important than this?" Even if the divine state's 7 laws were all dead, could it be more sorrowful than this? Chen Changsheng could imagine that the people outside Hanzhou City would definitely think that he was already dead, because he had not left through the gate of the Garden of Zhou. Instead, he had used an abnormally mystical method to directly appear on the snowy plains tens of thousands of li away. He could also imagine that many people would definitely have many different reactions upon learning of his death. Some people would probably be very happy, some people would feel relieved, and some people would definitely feel extremely sorrowful and sad. These people were all people who truly loved and cared for him, such as Luo Luo, Tang 36, Xianyuan Pa, Guardian Gene, and perhaps Emo, you would also feel some regret. He even felt that Go Hanshi, Guan Feibai, and the other disciples of the Mount Li sword sect were also part of these people, not to mention the elders of the Orthodoxy and that elf girl. He did not want these people to be sorrowful and anxious, so he was very anxious. He was anxious to quickly return to the human world and send the news that he was still alive back to the capital as quickly as possible, letting everyone know that he was still alive. Unfortunately, the snowy plains of the demon realm were too far from the human world, and Senior Su Li was truly rather heavy. Their escape from the snowy plains of the demon realm had actually gone very smoothly. A true expert of the path of the sword would inevitably possess great wisdom, no matter in any aspect, such as culinary arts or the art of tea. This was because all Daos were interlinked, and fleeing could be described as retreating. It had always been a part of the art of war, and Su Li was also very skilled in it. The strike that he had used to cleave open the sky had been very particular. That strike had cleaved open several hundred li of the path of the sword, heading straight south. It was extremely in accordance with the true meaning of the path of the sword. The straightest is the closest, and the closest is the fastest. But who could have imagined that the place where that strike had actually landed was actually in some snowy mountain range to the southwest? Black Robe had vaguely sensed something, but when the demon army had changed their strategy and surrounded that snowy mountain range from east to west, all that was left by the hot spring was a few bloodstains and a single jasmine flower that had been plucked. At that time, Su Li had already arrived in a glacier 400 li away. Of course, he was on Chen Changxing's body. Chen Changxing's body that had been bathed in dragon blood seemed to possess an inexhaustible amount of energy, providing him with a powerful strength that was enough for him to display an astonishing speed. To be able to run 400 li in such a short amount of time was truly rather astonishing. Even Su Li felt rather astonished, but the oncoming wind and snow were like knives cutting at his face. Every time he wanted to praise Qin Changsheng, the words that came out of his mouth would turn into angry rebukes. He did not linger in the glacier for even a moment. Qin Changsheng continued to madly run south along the crack in the ice. He felt rather thirsty, so he stabbed his hand into the ice beside him. 2 clear marks appeared on the pale blue and beautiful piece of ice, shards of ice flying in all directions. He stuffed the piece of ice into his mouth and felt that his body, which had heated up from running, had slightly cooled down. It was very comfortable. He ran through the glacier and the snowy plains, over the snowy ridges and great mountains. Qin Changsheng carried Su Li on his back as he madly ran without end. When he was thirsty, he would chew on some ice and snow, and when he was hungry, he would endure. He did not sleep day or night, until one day he finally saw a human city appear in the distance. Just like that, he traversed the 10,000 li of the snowy plains of the demon realm. He couldn't hold on any longer and directly fell backwards. The next chapter should be done before 11 o'clock. Chapter 361. When Qin Changsheng woke up, he discovered that he was still lying in the snow, and the sky was about to turn dark. Dusky rays of light shone down from the west, illuminating the low city in the distance, and also illuminating the rag wrapped around Su Li's body. This rag was something he had found in an abandoned hunter's tribe while he was fleeing. The edges had long been tattered, and now, illuminated by the twilight, it seemed like it was about to ignite. Su Li sat cross-legged in the snow, his head lowered. The rag covered his head, making it seem a little like a black robe. Chen Chongqing asked, "I'm lying in the snow, Senior. You're not going to do anything?" After running madly without end, he had finally passed through the endless snowy plains and distanced himself from the threat of the demons. One could imagine what kind of effort and price Chen Chongqing had paid for this, and how exhausted he was. The moment he saw the human city, he immediately fell to the ground and found it hard to get up. Yet, even under these circumstances, Su Li did not think of helping him, which made him feel rather uncomfortable. Su Li's voice came out from the rag, seeming very righteous and confident. "If I could move you, would I need you to carry me everywhere? Besides, when you fall to the ground and can't get up, can't you pay attention to your posture? Don't forget I'm on your back. If you fall with a plop, do you know how badly I'm squashed?" Chen Chongqing felt very helpless. As he fled, he would occasionally speak a few words with the senior. He had long since confirmed that he, who had never been good with words, could not gain any advantage in a conversation, even if he was clearly in the right. He supported his aching body and slowly crawled out of the snow. He walked up to Su Li, put him on his back again, and continued to advance into the distance. By the time he reached the human city, the sky was already completely dark. Fortunately, there were many torches lit on the city walls, illuminating the ground in front of the city. Only because of this did he, who was already extremely exhausted, not fall over because of the icicles on the road. This was an extremely simple and crude, yet extremely sturdy little city. To be more precise, this was the frontmost military stronghold of the Great Zhou's Northwest Army. There was no such thing as a curfew in the military stronghold, but those who entered the stronghold had to undergo an even more careful body search and inspection. It must be known that other than the most daring of adventurers, very few commoners would appear here. When he was being searched, Chen Chongqing was very worried that Su Li would be angry, so he nervously looked over. He did not expect that during the entire process, Su Li would be extremely honest, just like a real patient. The soldiers in the fortress began their routine interrogation. Chen Chongqing could not take out any documents to pass through the customs, nor did he have a travel pass. Just when he was preparing to state his identity and have the army send someone to pick him up, he suddenly saw Su Li shake his head imperceptibly. The two eyes that were covered by the rags revealed a firm determination that could not be resisted. Su Li took out 2 sets of customs clearance documents from somewhere on his body. 2 sets were very perfect, completely flawless customs clearance documents. By perfect, they included the degree of wear and tear of the documents. In short, they were impeccable. The soldier examined the 2 of them with a critical gaze. After hearing Su Li's reply, he waved his hand, indicating for the 2 of them to enter. At the same time, he instructed them on a few things to take note of. The only place in the military stronghold that commoners could live in was a carriage shop. As expected, it was a large shared bed. But tonight, there were only the 2 of them. The cold and stingy carriage shop owner naturally would not heat the Kong too hot, and there was not even hot water. As a result, Chen Chongqing and Su Li curled up in the sour and smelly bedding for a very long time, unable to sleep. Chen Chongqing opened his bright eyes and looked at the oil-stained roof. He thought about a few trivial matters, such as the fact that this large carriage shop might have been remodeled from a former kitchen. The waiter that had been scolded by the carriage shop owner looked very pitiful. Then he heard Su Li sigh and asked curiously, "Senior, you have all sorts of documents on you, and you were extremely skilled when you were being interrogated. You should have a lot of experience living outside, so why can't you sleep?" Everyone knew that Mount Li's junior marshal uncle, Su Li, liked to wander the 4 seas and rarely returned to Mount Li. In terms of experience on the road, logically speaking, there really should be no one more abundant than him. Su Li angrily said, "What are you thinking? Who am I? How could I have lived in such a terrible place?" Chen Chongqing thought to himself, if I had said your name before, the two of us would definitely not be sleeping on the cold Kong in the carriage shop, let alone the officers in the stronghold. Even the general's estate in the south would immediately send someone to pick us up. With this thought, he finally asked the question that had always lingered in his mind. Senior, why can't we reveal our identities? Su Li said, do you know what I'm most famous for? Why is the entire continent afraid of me? Chun Chongqing thought to himself, I grew up in the countryside of Xining village. Although I read a lot of the Taoist canon, I understand very little about the matters of the world. I only know that your cultivation is extremely high and your path of the sword is extremely strong. Why is it not respect, but fear? Su Li's voice seeped out from the cold bedding, seeming even colder. Because I've killed many demons and I've killed even more people. Other than Zhou Dufu from back then, there's probably no one else who has killed more people than me. Chun Chongqing was speechless. He thought to himself, Senior has once again habitually begun to show off his narcissism. If it really is like this, then aren't you a butcher whose hands are stained with blood? Why hasn't the Mount Li sword sect expelled you? As if guessing what he was thinking, Su Li's voice rang out once again. In Mount Li, my seniority is the highest, the strongest, so I'm the greatest. The discipline hall and those fellows on the mountain have long since found me displeasing to the eye. But what would they dare to do to me? Chen Chongqing was stunned. Su Li did not continue to introduce his great undertaking of killing people. He said, I naturally have my reasons for killing people. Cutting weeds and pulling up the roots, exterminating families. These things that don't require any skill, I've never done them. So this has brought me some trouble. That is, the more people I kill, the more enemies I have. Even now, I still can't clearly remember just how many enemies I have. Chun Chongqing's body slightly stiffened. He thought to himself, it can't be true, right? Then how did you still live until now? There are very few people who dare to find me for revenge, because I'm too strong. Of course, there are also some people who have been blinded by hatred and don't even care about life and death. They always want to kill me. Speaking of these things, Su Li's mood was clearly very bad. He said angrily, when I wake up in the morning, they come to kill me. When I sleep, they come to kill me. At every moment, they want to kill me, wave after wave. I just don't understand. Those people are at such a terrible level that they can't kill me no matter how they try. Why do they always want to find me? Don't they find it annoying? Even if they don't find it annoying, I will find it annoying, all right? Chun Chongqing was even more speechless. He thought to himself, putting life and death aside, if those people still want to kill you, then they definitely have a true blood feud with you. You actually say that they've been blinded by hatred and that they just find it annoying? Su Li continued, so I very rarely stay in Mount Li. When I travel the continent, I never reveal my true identity. If you don't want to be woken up in the middle of the night by someone using a magical artifact to go to the toilet, then it's best that you do the same. Chun Chongqing thought to himself, tonight's situation should be different from usual. The room was quiet for a very long time, and then Su Li's voice rang out once more. Only this time his voice was no longer so proud or irritated. It seemed very steady and very serious. Those people that want me dead are like a pack of dogs. They don't dare to move against me, and they don't even dare to bark from afar. They only dare to hide in the distant darkness, waiting for me to tire, waiting for me to grow old, waiting for me to get injured. Chun Chongqing looked at the roof. It was as if he could see the grassland in the night. A male lion gazed at its surroundings. In the darkness, there were countless of its enemies. If the male lion grew old, those enemies would rush forward and tear it into pieces. I understand, he said. Su Li said, it's good that you understand. Early in the morning, around 5 o'clock, Chun Chongqing opened his eyes and got out of bed. His face was somewhat pale, and he seemed somewhat haggard. However, he was much better than when he was fleeing on the snowy plains. It was just that his mind was even more tense than when he was fleeing. Because of what Su Yi had said last night, He always felt that this large carriage store, and even the entire military stronghold, was brimming with danger. In the dimly lit streets and the slightly warm kitchen, a sword shadow that could bring death could appear at any time. For an expert at Su Li's level, his enemies were assuredly extremely frightening. Chen Chongqing knew that he was no match for those people, so he could only hope that he could see through their movements and prepare for battle. He also knew that he might be overly sensitive, but when it came to matters of life and death, he had always believed that no matter how sensitive or careful he was, it was never excessive. The porridge was thin and fragrant, and the steamed buns were as hard as rocks. Sitting at the table and eating breakfast, he silently observed everything around him. He did not seem like a tourist, but more like a bodyguard. But Su Li was very natural, as if he did not care about anything. Chen Chongsheng silently thought to himself, that cold and stingy shopkeeper could still be considered normal, but the waiter that he had scolded last night was somewhat problematic. In a place with such vile living conditions, how could there be such a zealous waiter? Last night, when they were staying at the inn, that waiter had taken the initiative to ask if they wanted hot water, which resulted in him being scolded by the shopkeeper. Just at this moment, for some reason, the shopkeeper once again began to scold that waiter, using all sorts of obscenities that were hard to hear. Su Li continued to drink his porridge, occasionally raising his eyebrows, as if he was treating this scolding as an appetizer. After the quarrel came the beating. That waiter seemed extremely honest, and no matter how much he was scolded or beaten, he did not have any guts. He only held his head and ran around the inn. But Chen Chongqing became even more vigilant. That waiter ran to their table. Chen Chongqing unhesitatingly pulled out his dagger. That waiter did not see it, as if he was about to collide with his sword. If he sheathed his sword, or if he tilted his sword, that waiter would take advantage of the situation to get close. Logically, when a guest saw that the waiter that had been very attentive to him last night was about to collide with the sharp tip of a sword, even if it was in his instincts, he would still tilt to the side and give way. Chen Chongqing's breathing became slightly hurried. He did not know what he should do. Sheath his sword? If this was a real waiter, then he was indiscriminately slaughtering the innocent. If this was a fake waiter, then he was seeking his own death, and he was even going to implicate Senior Su Li. He did not know what to choose. Thus, Su Li made the choice for him. Su Li took the chopsticks in his hand and lightly stabbed at a certain place on his upper arm. This time there was no strength, no true essence, and no sword intent. Chen Chongqing's dagger, however, stabbed out like a bolt of lightning. This dagger did not stab at the waiter, because at the very beginning the dagger had tilted to the side. His dagger stabbed into the abdomen of the shopkeeper who was chasing after the waiter. Squelch! The dagger stabbed deeply, all the way to the hilt. Just like that, the shopkeeper died. Sorry for the delay. Chapter 362. The fresh blood flowed back along the blade, but was blocked by the edge of the sword, so it did not flow onto Chen Chongqing's hand. However, for some reason, he seemed to be able to feel the warmth of the blood. He even felt that his hand was somewhat wet and sticky, very uncomfortable. Then he remembered that this seemed to be the first time he had killed someone. From Xining Village to the capital, participating in the Ivy League gathering, the grand examination, the duels, and then entering the Garden of Zhou, he had fought in many battles. However, other than the demon general couple that had died in front of the mausoleum of Zhou, no one had died under his sword. In other words, this shopkeeper was the first person he had killed. The shopkeeper slowly collapsed in front of him. His round eyes were filled with unwillingness and despair. His face had long since lost its harsh appearance, only deathly ash. Chen Chongqing was silent for a while, then pulled out the dagger from his abdomen. After that he was silent again. He looked at Su Li, using his eyes to express his doubts. No matter how he looked at it, this shopkeeper did not seem like an assassin. On the contrary, there were many suspicious points about that waiter. Why did Senior borrow my sword to kill him? He was not like those passionate and hot-blooded youths who misunderstood that Su Li was indiscriminately killing the innocent. He did his best to remain calm and did not make a judgment beforehand. This was the best judgment, so Su Li was very satisfied. He said, "If you want to ask me why I killed him, it's very difficult for me to use simple words to explain." Chun Chongqing said, "He did not have any killing intent on his body, nor did he have the ripples of true essence of a cultivator." Su Li placed the bowl of porridge in his hands on the table and used his chopsticks to point at the shopkeeper's corpse in the pool of blood. He said, "To open a large cart in a place like a military stronghold, how could the shopkeeper not have any killing intent?" Chun Chongqing thought about it and understood what he meant. This truly was a point of doubt. Su Li said, also, he was too much like the owner of a large cart. He was harsh and easily angered. But in reality, this kind of resemblance only matched the impression the shopkeeper of a large cart has in the hearts of the people. The real shopkeeper of a large cart, in this kind of place where even birds don't shit, can be cold and indifferent. So how could he have the mood to teach his own waiter a lesson? Chun Chongqing felt that these words were to teach him, so he listened very seriously. Su Li used his chopsticks to point at the shopkeeper's corpse and continued, "Of course, these are only points of suspicion, not evidence. The evidence lies in the fact that there are no ripples of true essence on his body, but there is qi." Chun Chongqing lowered his head and rummaged through the shopkeeper's body for a moment. He found a magic tool that looked like a jade pendant. This magic tool could be used to conceal true essence fluctuations. "I can't teach you this. When you reach my level of cultivation, you will naturally be able to sense this aura." After Su Li finished speaking, he picked up the bowl of porridge and continued with his unfinished breakfast. Seeing his radiant appearance, he seemed to be very satisfied with the pickled vegetables provided by the cart store. "I originally thought it was the waiter because he was too friendly to us last night, and his hand." Chun Chongqing looked at the waiter, standing in front of the table. His gaze fell upon the area between the thumb and index finger of the waiter's right hand. There was an obvious ring of calluses, a sign that he had held a sword for a long time. The waiter's face was pale, and his body was trembling. He was obviously scared silly. As Su Li ate the porridge, he casually said, "The calluses between the thumb and index finger, other than holding a sword, can also be used to hold a knife. A kitchen knife is also a knife." Although a kitchen knife and a sword were two completely different objects, there really was no difference between the handle of a kitchen knife and the hilt of a sword. Chun Chongqing lowered his head to look at the blood-soaked dagger in his hand. His breathing became somewhat hurried, because he suddenly felt a lingering fear. Just now, if Su Li had not used his chopsticks to poke him, perhaps he really would have stabbed the dagger in his hand into the waiter's body. That would mean that he had killed an innocent person. If he had killed the wrong person, then what? A person only had one life. Killing the wrong person was the wrong person. There was no way to correct or make up for it. This was a fact that he found very hard to accept. Murder. Murder. At this moment, the waiter seemed to wake up. Looking at the corpse of the shopkeeper in the pool of blood, he let out an extremely frightened shriek. He rushed out of the store, but because of his fear and panic, he tripped over the shopkeeper's corpse and fell heavily to the ground. He did not care about the pain. In a flurry, he tried to climb up, but the sticky blood on the ground made him sway left and right. He looked extremely miserable and pitiful. Chun Chongqing felt somewhat apologetic. He went forward and prepared to help him up from the ground. At this moment, Su Li finally finished his breakfast. He wiped his mouth in satisfaction and once again placed the empty bowl of porridge on the table. Then he threw the chopsticks in his hand. He seemed very free and easy, very hedonistic. However, his chopsticks seemed to be thrown very casually, but they just happened to hit a certain place in Chun Chongqing's ribs. A very weak but ingenious force entered Chun Chongqing's body and controlled his movements. It made him slightly turn his body and at the same time his right hand shot forward like lightning. That blood-soaked dagger was still held in his right hand. With a squelch, the sharp dagger easily broke through the seemingly sturdy soft armor and pierced deeply into the waiter's chest, directly piercing through his heart. The waiter's face was full of shock. His throat gurgled and blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. He slowly fell forward and died. This time, Qin Changsheng was truly stunned. His face instantly paled. At this moment, the dagger was still deeply embedded in the waiter's chest. As he held it in his hand, he seemed to be able to clearly feel the entire process of the heart that the dagger had pierced through, from its slow beating to its complete stillness. He looked at Su Li with some unease. If Su Li could not provide sufficient proof, at least a proof that was stronger than the shopkeeper's, then he would find it very difficult to accept everything that had happened. Fine, since he needed strong proof, then he would find it himself. He used his slightly trembling hand to turn the corpse over. When he saw the little crossbow in the waiter's hand that was clearly dipped in poison, he finally let out a breath. "Senior Yu, how did you see this?" The gaze he used to look at Su Li was no longer uneasy, but filled with admiration. Su Li said, "Didn't you hear what the shopkeeper was cursing at the waiter?" At the time, Qin Changsheng's attention had been focused on the details of the shopkeeper's and the waiter's movements, so he did not pay attention to these contents. The shopkeeper's cursing was very splendid, and there was a lot of content. I'm referring to the specific content, like how the waiter was gluttonous and lazy. What does this prove? It proves that they truly knew each other. Su Li stood up and looked at the two corpses on the table. Or perhaps they were companions that grew up together. Who knows? In any case, I only know that the companions of an assassin are definitely also assassins. Qin Changsheng once again felt admiration. He thought to himself, it really is the details that determine success or failure. Experience is above everything. It's just that in the end there's still an element of conjecture. What if I killed the wrong person? Killed the wrong person? Then it's wrong. What else can I do? Su Li said expressionlessly. Then he opened his arms and said, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and come over." Qin Changsheng came to his senses and asked, "We're leaving just like that?" Su Li said unhappily, "Don't tell me we're still waiting for the soldiers of the stronghold to come and capture us." Qin Changsheng did not dare to say anything more. Taking advantage of the fact that the bloody incident in the cart shop had not alarmed the people of the stronghold, he carried Su Li away in the snowstorm, heading south. In a black willow forest to the southeast of the stronghold, the two of them stopped to rest for the time being. Qin Changsheng was actually very confused, since those people that wanted to kill Su Li already knew his whereabouts. Why did they still need to hide their identities? It was better to directly contact the great Zhou army and obtain their protection. Su Li said, "Those two guys are just assassins that can't be shown in public. They might not even know who I am and just happen to be active in this area." Qin Changsheng asked, "Who are those two assassins?" Su Li was truly rather annoyed. He said, "I already said that they're people that can't be shown in public. How would I know who they are?" Qin Changsheng thought about it, then said, "What you mean is that those two assassins are only working for money. But if your identity is exposed, the ones that come might not be such weak assassins, but true experts." Su Li said, "It's a very simple principle. Does it still need to be explained in such detail? Why are you such a chatterbox, little guy?" Qin Changsheng thought to himself, "Although I can't be said to be taciturn, and I'm usually not that good with words, it's just that seniors' actions are unpredictable. If I don't ask, I'll always feel somewhat uncertain." He persisted and asked, "Since it's like this, then why don't the demons just release your whereabouts?" Su Li said, "Because Black Robe is also not sure where I am. The people he colluded with in the human world, or perhaps those people who have a tacit understanding with him, are currently scattering people all over the world looking for me. Of course, even if those people were sure of my whereabouts, they would still not release this information. Chen Changsheng asked in confusion. And why is that? Su Li said, because other than the many people that want to kill me, there are also many people that want to help me. Chen Changsheng did not understand. Could it be that if Senior's whereabouts were known to the world, then there would be many people that would travel thousands of li to help you? Who am I? Su Li looked at him and asked seriously. Chen Changsheng was already used to his way of speaking. He was somewhat tired of it and also somewhat numb to it. His reply was rather mechanical. Junior martial uncle of Mount Li, a supreme expert on the path of the sword, the idol of the younger generation of cultivators. Compared to the Black Dragon, Su Li clearly only cared about the superficial things. He did not criticize him, and his reply was not at all heartfelt. He proudly said, "Isn't that it? Since I'm the idol of many people, if they know that I'm injured and in trouble, wouldn't those people be anxious to save me?" Chen Changsheng did not want to continue this topic. He asked, "Senior, then what do we do next?" Su Li said, "Of course we have to hide it from the eyes of everyone in the world and secretly send me back to Mount Li." Chen Changsheng thought to himself, Mount Li is far to the south of the continent, more than several tens of thousands of li from here. How difficult would it be to send him back to Mount Li? Moreover, we can't let anyone know. Just how worried would those people that are worried about me be? "Senior, why can't we let the people of Mount Li come and pick you up?" "Idiot, Mount Li is the furthest from here. By the time my disciples and grand-disciples come, it'll be too late." Chen Changsheng thought to himself, the closest to here is the great Zhou Northern Army, but Senior just happens to be unwilling to go find them. He could not help but say seriously, "Senior, I don't understand why Senior doesn't want to ask for help from the great Zhou Army. If it's a problem of face, then I can go ask for help. They will definitely send people to send us back to the capital." Su Li looked at him and sneered, "Is your position as principal of the Orthodox Academy really that amazing?" Chen Changsheng thought to himself, although my position as principal of the Orthodox Academy is nothing in front of Senior, to the great Zhou, I should still have some weight. Su Li said, "But have you ever thought, when everyone's eyes fall on you, how can I hide my identity?" Chen Changsheng looked at him and said sincerely, "Since those people that want to kill Senior have already appeared, then Senior's identity and whereabouts will eventually be exposed. Right now, what we need to strive for is time. Mount Li is indeed too far, and the capital is also too far, but the great Zhou army really is very close. As long as we reveal our identity, what else is there to worry about?" In the end, it still returned to the original suggestion, which was also the matter that he did not understand the most. Su Li looked at him and sighed. "I really don't know if you little fellow are naive or stupid." Chen Changsheng was stunned. He did not understand what this meant. Su Li looked at him and said with a smile that was not a smile, "You always say that I should ask for help from the great Zhou army. Could it be that you don't know on this continent the people that want me dead the most are you Zhou people?" As his voice fell, the snow on the black willow forest suddenly rustled and fell to the ground. The world became cold. The earth trembled slightly. In the distance, there were several hundred cavalry galloping across the snowy plains. These were the most elite snow cavalry of the great Zhou Northern Army. They seemed to be searching for something. The next chapter will be rather late. Chapter 363. Chen Changsheng's gaze pierced through the black willow forest and rested on the great Zhou cavalry in the snowy plains. He understood what Su Li had just said. Other than the demons, the people on this continent that wanted him dead the most were the people of Zhou. These great Zhou cavalry that were clearly searching everywhere for their target was clear proof, but he still felt that there were other possibilities. For example, these great Zhou cavalry had come to save them? Why do you always like to think of things in the worst possible way? Su Li listened to his question and said with a hint of mockery, "Because everything often develops according to people's worst assumptions." As if to prove his words, several dozen of the several hundred cavalry split off and rode towards the black willow forest. They painted a black line on the monotonous, snowy plains. Arriving in front of the black willow forest, the cavalry all unsheathed their weapons from their saddles and dropped their helmets. They seemed extremely vigilant, no matter how one looked at it. These cavalry did not come to save people, but to kill. The cavalry entered the forest, and the clopping of hooves could occasionally be heard. Occasionally, there would be the sound of a black willow branch snapping. Whether it was to save people or to kill people, they did not need to hide their tracks. And if the target they were searching for was really, as the intelligence had said, a cripple, then what happened next should be extremely simple. At some point, Chen Chongqing's right hand had already landed on the hilt of his dagger, ready to pull it out at any time. His body was currently very strong. Even if he had traversed 10,000 li of snowy plains, all his fatigue and hidden injuries had completely disappeared after a night's sleep on the cold calm. His true essence had gradually recovered, and even the injuries he had received in the garden of Zhou were much better. He was confident that he could defeat or even kill all the several dozen cavalry that had entered the forest, even if these cavalry were definitely elites that had succeeded in purification. But he did not have the slightest confidence that he could silently kill these cavalry without alerting the cavalry that was currently advancing east. More importantly, these cavalry were all soldiers of the great Zhou, while he was a person of Zhou. He truly could not just suddenly kill them without asking for any reason. He did not know what he should do. He silently stared at the indistinct figures of the cavalry in the black willow forest. As those figures got closer and closer, his breathing became more and more hurried, more and more nervous. The hand that gripped the hilt of his dagger became whiter and whiter. If he allowed the situation to continue like this, it would not be long before those cavalry saw him and Su Li's figures. "Senior, let's go." He finally made his decision. Turning around, he indicated for Su Li to come closer, and then he prepared to carry Su Li and escape. Since he could no longer continue to hide, nor could he unsheath his sword to kill, he could only run. Fortunately, he now possessed an unimaginable speed, so he was confident that those cavalry would not be able to catch up in a short amount of time. As for what sort of trouble the Zhou army would bring once they discovered his and Su Li's whereabouts, he temporarily did not care about it. Su Li had no intention of leaving. He said, "Open the umbrella." Chen Chongqing did not understand. He took the yellow paper umbrella and opened it. Then, according to Su Li's instructions, he poured his true essence into the handle of the umbrella. At the same time, he activated a certain mechanism on the umbrella ribs. A faintly discernible qi descended from the surface of the yellow paper umbrella. It was like a formless waterfall covering the surroundings. The cold wind was unable to blow into the yellow paper umbrella, but snow began to fall from the sky. The light snowflakes landed on the umbrella silently. Dozens of cavalrymen came to the depths of the black willow forest and stopped not far from them. Chen Chongqing was very nervous. Looking at the cavalrymen that were 10 yards away, he could even clearly see the color of the eyes of the leader of the cavalry. The dozens of cavalrymen acted as if they hadn't seen anything, continuing to disperse into the black willow forest. After an unknown amount of time, Chen Chongqing confirmed that the cavalrymen had already left the black willow forest. Only then did he realize that the two hands that were holding onto the handle of the umbrella and the hilt of the sword had become somewhat stiff because of his nervousness. "Close the umbrella," Su Li said. He did as he was told and properly closed the yellow paper umbrella. He tied it to his waist and then prepared to leave. "Don't be in too much of a hurry. Those cavalrymen should still be waiting outside," Su Li said again. Chen Chongqing did not question him. He once again sat down in the pile of snow by the tree. Afterwards, he looked at the yellow paper umbrella and sighed ruefully. "I really didn't think that this umbrella would have such a wondrous use." The corner of Su Li's mouth perked up. "Why don't you think about who I am?" Chen Chongqing did not respond. He really was somewhat tired of it, And he also knew that even if he did not respond, this narcissistic senior would definitely have a way to continue the conversation for him. Just as expected, Su Li's eyebrows perked up, as if he wanted to fly up. He proudly said, "This is a magical artifact that I and Old Man Tang designed together. It uses the heaven-shrouding sword as the pivot and uses countless rare materials as the body. Even meditation cultivators might not be able to see through the illusion. Don't tell me these ordinary cavalrymen want to see through my umbrella?" Chun Changxing wanted to say something, but then hesitated. Su Li's eyebrows perked up even higher. "If you have something to say, then say it." Chun Changxing said, "Senior, this umbrella is mine." The Black Willow Forest was very quiet. The snow fell without a sound. When they had first left the hot spring in the snowy ridge, they had argued over this matter. Chun Changxing thought about how heavily injured he was, so he did not continue. However, at this moment, he could not hold it in any longer, because he believed that this umbrella had always been his. Su Li looked at him and sneered. "Do you know the origins of this umbrella?" Chun Changxing had heard a few stories about the yellow paper umbrella from Zheshio. Combined with what he had seen and heard in the garden of Zhou and on the snowy plains, he basically knew everything. He nodded his head. Su Li paid no attention to him and continued to tell the story of the umbrella. In the end, he stared into Chun Changxing's eyes and said, "I found the sword, I designed the umbrella, and in the end you say that this umbrella is yours." Chun Changxing said, "But the materials for this umbrella were all found by the Tang Old Master. Back then, didn't Senior leave this umbrella in the Winshui Tangs because you couldn't afford it?" Su Li's expression gradually grew cold. "Say that again." Chun Changxing thought to himself that saying he couldn't afford it was indeed somewhat inaccurate. He reorganized his words and said, "Wasn't it because you, Senior, reneged on the debt that the yellow paper umbrella ended up in the Winshui Tang's hands?" Su Li was so angry that he laughed. "I am the most senior elder of Mount Li. I travel the 4 seas, raid and plunder and commit all sorts of crimes. Do you think I lack money?" Chun Changxing did not care that he had committed all sorts of crimes, such as raiding and plundering. He seriously explained, "But you didn't pay." Su Li realized that he had nothing to say, so he did not say anything. The atmosphere became rather awkward. Chun Changxing hesitantly stood up and climbed onto the black willow tree to observe the movements of the great Zhou cavalry in the distance. At the same time, he blew away the heat on his face. After a while, he descended from the black willow tree and said to Su Li, "Senior, those cavalry should have really retreated." Su Li ignored him. Chun Changxing said, "Senior, if those cavalry really did come to kill you, then do you still need to hide your tracks? You don't believe us, Zhou people, but there will always be people you can trust. Just like you said before, there will be people who will come to kill you, and there will also be people who will come to save you. Although you are far from the mountain, those people who want to save you might be very close." Su Li looked into his eyes and said, "The problem is, are there more people who want to kill me, or are there more people who want to save me? Which one is more urgent?" Chun Changxing said with some hesitation, "Senior, aren't you thinking of human nature too darkly?" "It's not human nature, it's the human heart. Human nature cannot be tested, and the human heart cannot be guessed. Fanatical love and loathing, in the end, are all benefits. Emperor Taizong was clearly a shameless person who killed his brother and forced his father, and Zhou Dufu was clearly a butcher who killed without counting. Why is it that in the eyes of ordinary people there is a golden light on their bodies? It's because Emperor Taizong and Zhou Dufu brought them enough benefits. They drove the demons back to Shualao City, allowing the humans living in the central plains to avoid the flames of war, to avoid being enslaved by other races. Thus, they're naturally what the hearts of the people desire." Su Li looked at him and seriously asked, "And me? I live in a peaceful era without war. Other than killing a few demon generals, I haven't done too much. What have I done for the human world?" What kind of benefits have I obtained for cultivators and the common people? Is it worth them traveling tens of thousands of li to help me? Is it because my path of the sword is powerful and invincible, and my bearing is free and unrestrained? It was clearly a very serious, even very serious discussion or instruction, but because of those last two sentences, it had a different flavor. Qin Changxing did not know how to respond at all. He asked, "Then what about the Southerners?" In ordinary people's minds, Mount Li's junior marshal uncle, Su Li, was currently the strongest person in the southern world. It was also because of his existence that the South could maintain its last dignity and pride before the flourishing Great Zhou. Of course, there are many Southerners who thank me, but there are also many Southerners who hate me. As I said a few days ago, I killed many people. Since I grew up in the South, then the majority of the people I killed were Southerners. They all had relatives, schoolmates, and descendants, so how could they like me? Of course, no matter how many people there are who hate me, they can't be the majority. Otherwise, wouldn't I become a street rat that everyone wants to beat up? The problem is that many years ago, I did something that disappointed the entire southern world, so there are more and more people who don't like me. What thing? Chen Chongsheng asked curiously. 10 years ago, the bloody case of the Orthodox Academy. You should know about it. I know. Speaking of which, is Taoist Ji really your master? Senior, actually, I really don't know about this matter. Fine, let's get back to the main topic. In short, after the case of the Orthodox Academy, the Pope was heavily injured, the army was in internal turmoil, the imperial court was in conflict, Zhou Tong was randomly killing people, the capital was in disarray, and your Zhou kingdom was in shambles. In the eyes of the Southerners, this was, without question, the best opportunity. Moreover, it has to be admitted that the longevity sect at the time was truly very strong, capable of contending with the Li Palace. And then, when the Southerners were about to act after several years of preparation, I went to the longevity sect for some reason and killed off all those elders. As a result, the matter they were preparing to do could only be left unsettled. Senior, this sort of secret is truly shocking to hear, but why do I always feel that Senior is using this method to praise himself? What's there to praise about such a tragic matter? It was very rare that Su Li did not continue to praise himself. His expression was so calm that it made one's heart palpitate. See you tomorrow. Chapter 364. Su Li expressionlessly said, "The Southerners' best and last chance was lost just like that. What will they thank me for? Other than thinking that I'm a madman, the people of Zhou won't thank me." Qin Changxing thought it over, then said, "Not liking, not thanking, does not mean that they want Senior to die." Su Li said, "In the blink of an eye, 10 odd years have passed. Tianhai, Old Manin, and that woman from Holy Maiden Peak still wholeheartedly want the confluence of North and South, but I still don't agree. If I don't agree, Mount Li won't agree, and the longevity sect won't agree. The confluence of North and South will forever be a large flat cake drawn on paper. Tell me, do these saints not want me to die?" Hearing Su Li's words, Qin Chongxing fell silent for a very long time. Thinking back to when he had just left the garden of Zhou and the great battle array he had seen on the snowy plains, he said, "The demons also want Senior to die. Don't you think this is very absurd? Remember, the enemy of an enemy is not necessarily a friend, because there is something called benefit in the middle. If I die, the continent will be thrown into turmoil, and the Demon Lord and Tianhai are also the two most confident people in the world. They are confident that they can use the chaos to obtain what they want, so of course they want me to die." Chen Chongsheng looked at Su Li and said very seriously and sincerely, "Senior, then why don't you support the confluence of North and South? No matter how you look at it, this matter is beneficial to the human race." "Do I have to do things that are beneficial to the human race? Fine. These words are too much like the words of a great villain. I take them back." Su Li looked at him and calmly said, but can you answer a question of mine? What's the difference between being ruled by Tianhai and being ruled by the demons? Chen Chongsheng really wanted to say that the difference was too great. A war between races could easily lead to the danger of extinction, while a war between humans was just a question of who lowered their heads. However, he knew that to a person like Su Li, being ruled was in itself an unacceptable situation. There truly was not much difference between the two. Senior, could it be that the world in your eyes has always been so dark? It's not dark, but colorless, cold ice. I've said it before, its benefit. Could it be that we can't think of the world in a positive light? This was already the third time Qin Chongxing had asked a similar question. No, because such things have happened many times in the past. The so-called history is nothing more than the current evidence, and the so-called present is nothing more than the repetition of history. Su Li looked at him and said, I don't want to become the second Zhou Dufu, so no matter if it's the demons or you people of Zhou, I won't believe them. The black willow forest became silent again. After a long period of silence, Chen Chongsheng suddenly opened his mouth and asked, Senior, are you teaching me? From the moment they entered the stronghold, Su Li and Qin Chongxing began to converse more. Afterwards, no matter if it was the encounter with the assassins or the great Zhou cavalry, or the seemingly casual but actually rather meaningful choice of topic, they all indicated that Su Li was trying to teach Qin Chongsheng a few things, how to view this world and how to continue living. Su Li looked at him and said with slight mockery, Isn't it a little too late to understand now? Rumor has it that you are well versed in the Taoist canon. But why can't I see the slightest bit of comprehension in you? But why is that? Chen Chongxing did not care about the senior's mockery, but he was rather puzzled. He was a person of Zhou, and Su Li was a southerner. He was the founding monster of the new generation that the orthodoxy had focused on nurturing, while Su Li was the great freedom of the way of the sword. The two of them originally had no connection, and the camps they belonged to were even secretly hostile. Not to mention the terrible relationship between the Orthodox Academy and the Mount Li sword sect, and the possible competition between him and Qiu Shanjun in the past and in the future. Su Li had no reason to teach him like a teacher, because I admire you very much. Su Li looked at him expressionlessly and said, Is this reason enough? Chen Chongxing very honestly shook his head and said, Senior, of course it's not enough. Su Li was somewhat at a loss for words. If it were any other junior who was so patiently taught by him, they would not be moved to tears. At the very least, after he had given them a reason, they would definitely not continue to pursue the matter. He looked at the clear and bright eyes of the youth and suddenly laughed. He thought to himself, that's right. If this kid wasn't this kind of person, how could he have caught my temper? Because I hope that you can live on well. The longer you live, the better, he said seriously to Qin Chongsheng. Qin Chongsheng was slightly startled. He thought to himself, could it be that Senior knows about my severed meridians and that I don't have long to live? Su Li's following words indicated that he did not know this secret. He said, because only by living long enough can you become strong enough. I hope that you can continue to be strong until the very end. What's the very end? The next pope. Senior hopes that I become the next pope? Correct, because if you become the pope, it's the best thing for the Southerners. Why? Because you're not willing to kill people, and even more so, you won't revel in killing people. You're very clear about everything other than life and death. I've never seen a young man at your age that doesn't care about fame and fortune. Of course, your obsession with my yellow paper umbrella sometimes makes me begin to doubt my own judgment. I don't know how Senior saw that I don't care about fame and fortune, but can I become the Pope just like this? Qin Chongsheng subconsciously looked at the dusky sky, looked at the snowflakes falling from an unknown height, and said, It feels so far away. Su Li looked at him with some interest and said, Could it be that you've never had this sort of awareness? Qin Chongsheng withdrew his gaze and asked in a slight daze, What awareness? The Li Palace attaches so much importance to you and nurtures you. making you the youngest upper-level ethereal opening cultivator in history, the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy. If they didn't want you to become the next pope, what did those old fellows want to do? Chen Changsheng was silent. He now knew why His Eminence Bishop Melisha was so concerned about him, and what the pope was thinking. After leaving the mausoleum of books, all the mysteries had long since been answered. But he had never been very clear about this matter, and subconsciously did not want to remember it. Too many things had happened in the Garden of Zhou, so much so that he believed that he had truly forgotten about this matter. Only now did Su Li wake him up. He was the successor of the orthodoxy. However, his gaze still habitually fell on a place not far in front of him. He was not used to raising his head to look at the sky. Whether it was the dusky sky or the clear blue sky, the light was always so dazzling. If he returned to the capital, as the successor of the orthodoxy, he might have to directly face the divine empress dignity. This made him very uneasy. Of course, he first had to return to the capital. Today the leader was celebrating his birthday. He only returned home after 9 o'clock. In a hurry, he wrote more than 3,000 characters. In the end, when he examined it, he discovered that the last 1,000 or so characters were completely wrong. The mistakes were shocking, so he could only delete them. I'll post this. Tomorrow there will be 2 chapters.